Chapter 27 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marianne Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 27. A Rope Trick. This conversation with Fitzgerald gave his housemate ample food for serious reflection. If Kraus was a deep-dyed scoundrel, and his wife a victim of a cocaine habit, what a home for Sophy! If he could only take her away from it! But what grounds had he for hoping that she would marry him? In spite of their pleasant meetings, their rides and dances, he had never ventured to hint at his real feelings, knowing that he was far from being what is called an eligible match, and having a surprisingly humble opinion of his own merits. He was now receiving 500 rupees a month, which after all did not go far in expensive Rangoon. Could a man marry on such an income, or on the supposition that what was barely enough for one would be sufficient for two? As far as he was in a position to judge, Sophy's ideas were not extravagant, and she would be better almost anywhere than in her present abode. But he had not the slightest right to suppose that she cared 2 pence for him. On the other hand, he had a hateful and well-founded conviction that not a few of the young men among her acquaintances would be glad to claim Miss Lee as a wife. There were Fotheringay, the ADC, Gubbins of the oil company, and 1 or 2 others fluttering about her and scorching their wings. After a month of procrastination and delay, the Rangoon Commissariat Department, under an energetic new official, decided to embark a collection of 60 elephants, which had long been awaiting transport from the neighborhood of Rangoon to India. Now a large sailing ship had been chartered to carry this interesting cargo across the Bay of Bengal to Vizagapatam, where they would be scattered to work in all parts of the country. The sailing ship was anchored across the river at Dalla, and in order to reach their destination, the elephants were called upon to swim the Rangoon River. 60, no fewer, mostly young animals which had been caught and trained, the property of the Indian government. The move took place upon Thursday, the garrison holiday, and a large number of people were assembled to witness this unusual departure. The emigrants were ranged up in groups. 2 huge tuskers appeared to be in charge of the business of embarkation, and, to do them justice, carried it out with conspicuous success, taking it in turn to convoy select parties across the river, here a mile wide. The personally conducted were at first delighted to be in the water. They splashed and played about like huge porpoises, and were smacked and kept in order like naughty children by their great tusker nurse, and eventually guided to a landing. Some, on the other hand, did not enjoy the excursion, were alarmed by the force of the current, and turned tail. These were chased vigorously, chastised, herded in the way they should go, and escorted to the other side. All save one, which obstinately refused to quit terra firma, and was accordingly fastened to a launch in order to be towed across. But the powerful and headstrong brute towed the launch inland, and, having utterly smashed it and destroyed several bamboo sheds, effected its triumphal escape. Meanwhile 59 were assembled at Dalla, patiently awaiting their fate. A number of people had collected on the landing stage, close to the big ship, to watch her strange cargo being placed on board. The lower hold of this huge foremaster had been entirely cleared, and into this receptacle the devoted elephants were lowered by a gigantic steam crane. Meanwhile they were formed up behind a huge shed in order that none should witness the scheme of departure or the undignified transfer of its companions. A selected victim was coaxed, flattered, caressed, and then marched proudly down to the pier between 2 deceitful and majestic tuskers, a pair of stern old gentlemen that would stand no nonsense. Soothed and bribed by a generous supply of sugar cane, the unsuspicious traveler was halted directly under the crane. A belly band encircled his enormous waist, and to this was attached a hook. Then, at given signal, the astonished animal was suddenly hoisted into the air. And what a sight! Trunk waving madly, legs wildly reaching for foothold, a helpless and ridiculous monster, endeavoring to clutch the rigging. Presently the frantic passenger was slowly lowered to the hold, where his own beloved mahout and a pile of luscious lucerne awaited his agitated arrival. Lookers-on found the spectacle of a helpless elephant struggling in mid-air excessively amusing, and the immediate neighborhood of the ship was crowded. Here were the Pomeroys, Maitlands, Morgans, Puffles, Mrs. Gregory, Miss Lee, and numbers of others, including Shafto, who, much interested in this novel sight, had taken several snapshots. Just as he snapped the last elephant, he felt the sharp jerk of a rope round his ankles, and in another second was swept into the racing Irrawaddy. As the water surged over his head, the sharp shock and the submersion momentarily took away his breath. Shafto was a strong swimmer, but the current was tremendous and not to be denied. It carried him right out into the middle of the river, spinning him round and round like a leaf in a torrent. He realized his danger, and that his lease of life could now be counted by seconds. His thoughts flew straight to Sophy. With a sensation of piercing agony, he felt that he would never see her again. By extraordinary good fortune, a steam launch, which was crossing, had noticed the swimmer's dark head, as well as the shouts and the signals from the landing stage, and promptly overtook him, drew him breathless and half-drowned on board, and landed him at Dala. Shafto had had a miraculous escape, for those who fall into the Irrawaddy rarely emerge alive. His adventure was much discussed and debated for one whole day at Gregory's and elsewhere. "How on earth did it happen? Lucky you were clear of the ship, otherwise you would have been sucked underneath and never been found," remarked a friend. "We cannot imagine how you tumbled in. Did anyone shove you?" "Oh, I just tripped over a rope," he announced, when questioned at the club, but to Fitzgerald he confided the truth, the whole truth. "I was standing pretty close to the edge of the stage, among a lot of natives, as it happened, taking snapshots of the elephants, when all of a sudden I felt a rope twist round my legs. It gave sort of a sharp pull, and the next moment I was in the water. It's a nasty experience to have the Irrawaddy closing over your head. I have its taste in my mouth still. I'll swear that there were hands at the end of the rope, and that I saw no rope about when I first came to the pier, for I happened to be early, and it was pretty empty. Later, there was a big crowd, and a lot of pushing and hustling. I noticed several Chinamen hanging round and pressing together. Now that I come to think of it, they surrounded me. The rope was not the usual thick hawser, but something thinner and more flexible, more like whipcord such as a fellow could carry in his pocket." "What did I tell you?" said Fitzgerald, thumping on the table with both his fists. "We must get a move on and try to corner Kraus. That rope was a preliminary experiment, and all but landed you in Kingdom Come." End of chapter 27.
Section 28 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chit. Although Shafto had many acquaintances and continual engagements, he never forgot his first friends, the Salters, and still strolled over of an evening, accompanied by Roscoe, to sit on the veranda, talk, smoke, and listen, until his companions began to discuss such abstract questions as, what is the real driving force of life? Or to argue on the philosophy of Buddhism, or Herbert Spencer's descriptive sociology, and the unknowable. When conversation turned in this direction, Shafto felt entirely out of his element and slipped indoors to play games with Rosetta or her mother. Recently, it had struck him that Ma Chit appeared to have become more or less a permanent member of the establishment, being so constantly with her cousin. She took an enthusiastic interest in Rosetta's brick building, superintended and sharply criticized Malay's games of dominoes, and even suggested herself as a substitute. Burmese dominoes are black with brass points and held in the hand like cards. Mrs. Slater, a keen and clever opponent, indignantly refused to relinquish her post to her relative, and was radiant and triumphant when she carried off a stake of 8 annas. Shafto would have enjoyed these matches and this contest of wits and luck had Ma Chit been elsewhere, instead of leaning on his chair, looking over his hand, laughing, throwing quick glances, and making idiotic remarks. Once he had been not a little startled to find her tiny brown fingers inserted between his collar and his neck. He shook them off impatiently. He hated such practical jokes, and said so in no measured terms. More than once he had been solemnly assured the fascination of this girl's personality worked like a charm, and it had become disagreeably evident that she wished to cast a spell over him. How often had her bright black eyes imparted an alluring tale? However, he felt himself well protected by an impenetrable shield on which was inscribed the name of Sophy, and Ma Chit gracefully posturing with tingling bangles and twittering talk had no more effect upon her prey than a stone image. No, although she hung over him, tapped him with two eloquent fingers, whispered jokes in his ear, and filled his nostrils with an exquisite and voluptuous perfume, she was powerless. One evening he happened to be playing chess with Salter. Roscoe was at Pew. Mealy was putting Rosetta to bed, but Ma Chit was present, listening, smiling, and smoking her white cheroot. At the conclusion of a close and hard-fought game, in which Shafto was victorious, she leant over, gazed into his eyes, and stroked his face with two caressing fingers. As he drew back quickly, she burst out laughing and exclaimed, "But why are you so shy, dear boy? Always so shy, so odd and so foolish." Shafto found the siren undeniably pretty and seductive, but at the same time irrepressible and odious. He hated her cat-like litheness, her undulating walk, and the unmistakable invitation of her whole personality. "Come, Ma Chit, behave yourself," said her host sternly. "If you can't, you don't come here again." The beauty received this admonition with a scream of laughter, tossed a flower at Salter, wafted a kiss to his guest, and faded away into the veranda. By degrees, thanks to his constant encounters with Ma Chit, Shafto avoided the Salters' bungalow, and Roscoe made his visits alone. But as it was not more than 300 yards from the chummery, Shafto had a painful conviction that, when dusk and darkness had fallen, the neighborhood of his compound was haunted, not by the malignant and resident gnat, but by the graceful and sinuous figure of a little Burmese girl. Once a stone, to which was attached a paper, was thrown into his room. On it was inscribed in a baboo's clerky hand, "Do come and talk to Ma Chit." End of section 28.
Chapter 29 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marianne Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 29. Mung Baw. Returning one evening from a lively dinner at the barn, Shafto was surprised to see a light in his room, and still more surprised to find the Pongyi once again seated on his bed. "Oh, so you've come back," he exclaimed aghast, and a shadow of annoyance settled on his face. "I have so," calmly responded his late visitor. "As I was passing, I thought I'd give you a call in. I came down a couple of weeks back, as I have some small business here and wanted to show myself to a doctor. I don't hold with them native medicines and charms, and I'm inclined to a weakness in me inside." "Why, you look as strong as a horse," was Shafto's unsympathetic rejoinder, as he sank into a chair and pulled out a cigarette. The Pongyi contributed a special personal atmosphere, composed of turmeric, woolen stuff, and some fiercely pungent herb. "Looks is deceitful, and so is many a fine fellow," observed the Pongyi in a dreamy voice. After this pronouncement he relapsed into a reflective silence, a silence which conveyed the subtle suggestion that the visitor was charged with some weighty mission. At any rate, it was useless for Shafto to think of undressing and going to bed, since his couch was already occupied by the holy man, who appeared to be established for the night. Interpreting Shafto's envious glance, he said, "You'll excuse me sitting on the charpoy, but I've got entirely out of the use of chairs, and me bones are too stiff to sit doubled up on the floor like a skewered chicken." "Oh, that's all right," said Shafto, who was very sleepy. "I suppose you have just come from Upper Burma?" "Yes, that's the part I most belong to, and that suits me. I can't do with this soft, wet climate, though I am an Irishman. I'm from Mogok, that's the ruby mine district, but what I like best is the real jungle. Oh, you'd love to see the scenery and walk through miles and miles of grand trees on the upper Chindwin. Forests blazing with flowers and alive with birds, not to speak of game. Many's the time I've been aching for the hold of a gun, but of course it was an evil thought." "Your religion forbids you to take life?" "That's true. I've not tasted meat for years, but there's not a word to be said agin fish or an odd egg. Tell me something more about your new faith." "Well, now, let me think," said the Pongyi meditatively. "We have no regular service for marriage or burial, and no preaching. We keep the 5 great rules: poverty, chastity, honesty, truth, and respect all life. There are 227 precepts besides. Most men can say them off out of the big book of the Palamuk, and there are stacks and stacks, thousands of stacks of sacred writings. But I just stick to the 5 commandments, the path of virtue, and the daily prayers. The singing and chanting is in Pali, a wonderful, fine, loud language. Many of the Pongyis is teachers, for every boy in Burma passes through their hands. But I'm no schoolmaster, though I was once a clerk in the orderly room. I could not stand the gabble of them scholars, all roaring out the same words at the top of their voices for hours together." "I can't imagine how you pass your time," remarked Shafto, "or how you stand the idleness, a man like you who were accustomed to an active life." "Oh, I get through me day all right. In the early morning there's prayers and a small refreshment, and I sit and meditate. The young fellows, like novices, sweep and carry water and put flowers about the Buddha. Then we all go with our bowls in our hands, parading through the village, looking neither right nor left, but we get all we want and more, for giving is a great merit. When we return to the kyung, we have our big midday meal, and then for a few hours I meditate again. The life suits me. It's a different country from India, with its blazing sun and great bare plains. There the people seldom has a smile on them. Here they are always laughing. Here all is green and beautiful, with fine easy times for flowers and birds and beasts. There's peace and kindness. Oh, it's a fine change from knocking about in barracks and cantonments, drilling and route marching and sweating your soul out. By the way, have you the talisman I gave you? If you mean the brown stone, yes. That stone was slipped into my begging bowl one day. Not much of a find as an eatable. That is so. Although, according to fairy tales, the likes has dropped out of people's mouths before now. Ye may not suspicion the truth, but it's a big fine ruby. I believe it was found stuck in red mud in the ruby district, and someone who had a wish for me dropped it into the potah, and I, who have a wish for you, pass it on. But if it is so valuable, I could not dream of accepting such a gift, protested Shafto. You will have to take it back. Thanks awfully, all the same. Oh, ye never rightly know the price of them stones till they are cut, but the knowledgeable man I showed it to said it might be worth a couple of £1,000, and I've come to tell ye this, so that ye can turn it into coin, and if you wanted to get out of Burma, there you are. Well, that is most awfully good of you, but I really could not think of accepting your treasure, or its value in money, and I have no wish to leave Burma. The country suits me all right. As he ceased speaking, Shafto got up, unlocked a leather dispatch box, and produced the ruby, which he placed in the large, well-kept hand of the visitor. Well now, I call this entirely too bad, the latter exclaimed as he turned it over, and I need not tell ye that I can make no use of the ruby, being vowed to poverty, which you are not. And I want to offer some small reward for what ye did for me last time I was down in Rangoon. I can't think what ails ye to be so stiff-necked. Is there nothing at all I can do for ye? Well, Mung Baw, since you put it like that, I believe you could give me what would be far more use than a stone, some valuable help. Valuable help, repeated the Pongyi, adjusting false horn spectacles and staring hard. Then as far as it's in me power, the help of every bone in me body is yours and at your service. Thank you. Now tell me, have you ever heard of the cocaine trade in Burma? Is it cocaine, to be sure? It's playing the mischief in Rangoon and all over the country. I want you to lend a hand in stopping it. If we could only discover the headquarters of the trade, it would be worth 1,000 rubies. I have a sort of notion I could put me finger on a man that runs the concern. Ever since he come into Burma, he has been pushing the world before him and doing a great business. From my position, being part native, part British, part civilian, and more or less a priest of the country and clever at languages, I've learnt a few things I was never intended to know. Then I expect you have picked up some facts about cocaine smuggling. That's true, though I never let it soak into me mind. But from this out, I promise ye I'll meditate upon it. If you can help the police burst up this abominable traffic, you will deserve to go to the highest heaven in the Buddhist faith. I'll do me best. I can say no fairer. I'm sorry you won't take the ruby, turning it over regretfully. Maybe your young lady would fancy it. It would look fine in a ring. But I have no young lady, Mung Baw. Is that so? He paused as if to consider the truth of this statement, cleared his throat, and went on. The other day, when I was down by the lake, I saw a young fellow, the very spit of yourself, riding alongside of a mighty pretty girl on a good-looking bay thoroughbred." Here he again paused, apparently awaiting a reply, but none being forthcoming, resumed. "And now, before I go, I want to give ye what ye can't refuse or return, and that's a wise word. It was not entirely the ruby stone as brought me here. It was some loose talk." "Loose talk, Mung Baw? And you a Buddhist priest? I'm astonished." "Yes, talk straight out of Fraser Street, my son. Many of our priests are holy saints, altogether too good to live, with no thought whatever of the world, given over entirely to prayer and self-denial, blameless, and without one wicked thought. But there does be others that is totally different. 'Tis the same in a regiment, good soldiers and blackguards. Some of the Pongees, when the prayers is done, spend all their days gossiping, chewing betel nut, and raking through bazaar. Mud." Then suddenly he leant forward and stared at his companion as if he were searching for something in his face, and he asked, "Do you happen to know a girl called Chit?" Shafto moved uneasily in his creaking wicker chair. After a moment's hesitation he replied, "Yes, I know her." "Don't let her put the come hither on you. These Burmese dolls have a wonderful way with them. She's a gabby little monkey, and they say she has chucked Bernard and taken a terrible fancy to you. I would be main sorry to see you mixed up with one of these young devils, for I know you are a straight living gentleman." "There is not the smallest chance of my being what you call mixed up with any young devil," said Shafto in a sulky voice. "As for Chit, she is not the sort you suppose." "Oh, maybe not," rejoined the Pongee in a dubious tone. "Still, I know Burma, lock, stock, and barrel, and a sight better nor you. Of course, I never spake to a woman, and give them all wide berth. But I cannot keep me ears shut. Listen to me, sir. These young torments have no scruple. Chit is dead set on you, and that's the pure truth. Now there's one thing I ask and beg. Never take or smoke a cigarette she might offer." "Not likely. I only smoke Egyptians or a pipe. But tell me, why am I to refuse Chit's cigarettes?" "The reason is this, and a good one. These black scorpions employ what they call love charms. Oh yes, laugh, laugh, laugh away. But one of these charms would soon make you laugh the wrong side of your mouth. They are deadly. Let me tell you, a cigarette loaded with a certain drug has been the ruin of more than one fine young fellow. I disremember the name of the stuff. It begins with an M, and is surely made in hell itself, for it drives a man stark mad. Once he smokes it, he falls into a pit, and is lost forever, body and soul." "Come, I say, isn't this a bit too thick, Mung Baw?" "Well, you ask the doctors. There's a good few cases of lunacy and suicide in this country, all caused by a love charm. So when Chit sidles up, showing her teeth, and offers you a smoke, you will know what to do. Now," concluded the visitor, scrambling to his feet, "I must be on the move. I am stopping for a while at the big Pongyi Kyung, near Turtle Tank, and if you should happen to be riding round that way, we might have a talk on this cocaine business. If I am to go into it neck and crop, I can't be coming about here, as it would excite suspicion." "All right, then. I'll turn up, and you will report progress. But how am I to spot you among the crowd of priests?" "Easy enough," replied Mung Baw, drawing himself up to his full height. "I am the tallest Pongee in Rangoon." "Yes, no doubt. Burmese are a bit undersized, but fine, able-bodied fellows. I suppose you've seen the wrestlers?" "Yes. Now, before you go, can I get you a drink or a smoke?" "Oh, as for a smoke, I'm thinking your tobacco would not be strong enough for me. But I don't say that I wouldn't like a drink, although I am a sober man. Just the least little taste of whiskey and water, as a sort of souvenir of old times. Ye might bring it in here, for I don't want them native chaps making a scandal about me." As soon as Sapong Yi had been secretly supplied with a fairly moderate souvenir, he resumed his sandals, picked up his umbrella and begging bowl, and, with a military salute to Shafto, swept down the rickety stairs. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marianne Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 30. Enlightenment. Miss Fuchsia Bliss was still in Rangoon, and, as she modestly expressed it, crawling round on approval. She had brought letters of introduction to the Lieutenant Governor, the Pomeroys, and the Gregorys. Sir Horace and Lady Winter had no young people, so she presently passed on to the Pomeroys, who in their turn reluctantly yielded their guest to Mrs. Gregory. Hosts and hostesses were only too glad to secure the company of Miss Bliss, a girl who had seen so many strange countries and noticed so much with her sharp eyes that her inferences and original remarks were equally novel and interesting. Fuchsia's society was invigorating, and the American could easily have put in 12 months in Burma if so disposed. But one obstacle, and one only, interposed, and detained her from joining her friends in Cairo. This is in the strictest confidence. She was awaiting the moment when that great big stupid Irishman would speak. Although Fuchsia looked no more than 2 or 23, 28 summers had passed over her ash-colored head. She had received an excellent education and had traveled far, and was as experienced, as world-wise as any matron of 50. Indeed, in natural wit and the art of putting 2 and 2 together, she was considerably ahead of most of her sex. Mrs. Gregory enjoyed having young people with her, but her mornings were engaged. She had a hand in the principal benevolent societies in the place, was treasurer of this or secretary of that, apart from her housekeeping and large correspondence, so that she was rarely at liberty before tiffin. Therefore Fuchsia had all the forenoon to herself, and spent the time visiting her girlfriends or shopping in the bazaar. The heiress had hired a motor, a little 2-seater that she could drive, and with respect to locomotion was entirely independent of her hostess. No one in Fuchsia's circle received so many visits as Sophy Lee. She was fond of Sophy and frequently turned up at Heidelberg to tiffin or to tea, although she did not care about the set of people that she met there. Stout German ladies with somewhat aggressive manners, or second-rate women from the fringe of society. Every one of these was, in the eyes of the little American Democrat, an outsider. Fuchsia was fastidious, an aristocrat to her fingertips, and it was no drawback to Pat Fitzgerald that his maternal uncle was an earl. How could Sophy tolerate these stupid people? Fuchsia asked herself, with their sharp, probing questions and heavy jokes. Why did Mrs. Krause invite them? And here she came to yet another question. What was the matter with Mrs. Krause? There was something strange and mysterious about her ailment. Her attacks were so fitful. Now she appeared brilliant and vivacious, with gleams of her former great beauty, the gracious and agreeable hostess. Again, her condition was that of sheer indifference and semi-torpor. And who was the officious and familiar Aya, her attendant and shadow, an obtrusive creature with bold black eyes and a resolute mouth? Why did she speak so authoritatively to her mistress? Why did she wear such handsome jewelry and expensive silk saris, heavily fringed with gold, and strut about with such an air of importance? Lily appeared to have enormous influence with Mrs. Krause. She knew something. She held some secret. This was the conclusion at which Fuchsia the shrewd arrived after she had paid a good many visits to Heidelberg. Fuchsia, with her long chin resting on her hand, set her active brain and cool judgment to work. She recalled a certain scene one evening when she had driven over in her car to take Sophy to the theater, and was sitting in the veranda half hidden by a screen awaiting her friend, whilst Mrs. Krause, lying prone upon the sofa, fanned herself with a languid hand. Presently, from a doorway, Lily noiselessly drifted in. She was amazingly light-footed for her bulk. "Now, it is 9 o'clock," she said, addressing her mistress, "and you have got to go to bed." Her voice was sharp and authoritative. The reply came in a low murmur of expostulation. "I'm going to the pagoda tonight," continued Lily, "but you will be all right. As soon as you are undressed, you shall have your dose." On hearing this promise, Mrs. Krause furled her fan, rose from the sofa with astonishing alacrity, and followed her ayah as commanded. Now the question that puzzled Fuchsia was, what was the nature of the dose? It must have been something agreeable, or Mrs. Krause would not have bounded off the sofa and hurried away. And who would rush for a dose of quinine, or even the fashionable petrol? Undoubtedly the dose was a drug, some enervating and insidious drug. This would amply account for the lady's lethargy and languor. The crafty Fuchsia threw out several feelers to her hostess on the subject of Heidelberg. She wondered whether anyone shared her suspicions. Certainly Mrs. Gregory did not, but sincerely lamented her neighbor's miserable health, and deplored her obstinacy in remaining season after season in Rangoon. "It's rather a dull house for poor Sophy," suggested her friend. "When her aunt has one of her bad attacks, she sees no visitors for days. Mr. Krause is absent from morning till night. Not that I consider his absence any loss, for I dislike him more than words can express." "Well, I can't say that I am one of his admirers," admitted Mrs. Gregory, "but I agree with you that Sophy has some long and lonely hours. She can come over here whenever she pleases, and she cannot come too often, for she is a dear girl, and I would be glad to have her altogether. You know she and I were housemates up at Mamio, and when you live with another person in a small bungalow, that is your opportunity to get down to the bedrock of character." It was about a week after the elephants had been transported across the river, and Sophy and Fuchsia were sitting in the latter's bedroom at the barn. Sophy was altering a hat for her companion. She was remarkably clever in this line, and a surprising quantity of her friend's millinery had passed through her fingers. "Mr. Shafto had a narrow squeak this day week," remarked Fuchsia, who was lounging in a chair doing nothing. "Did you hear someone say that he was pushed in?" "Oh, no, by accident or on purpose?" "Whichever you please. The result was the same." Then, after a considerable pause, she added significantly, "Perhaps he knows too much." "Too much of what?" asked Sophy, looking up. "Oh, there are many secrets in Rangoon," said Fuchsia, nodding her head. "I have grasped that, although I have only been here 2 months, and you a whole year. Have you never noticed anything? Have you no suspicions about people?" "No, not of anything that matters. I suspect that the eldest Miss Wiggin rouges and darkens her eyebrows, that Lady Puffle wears a wig, and that the Grahams are thoroughly sick of their paying guest. But you are 10 times cleverer than I am, Fuchsia, and, according to Mr. Gregory, singularly intelligent and acute." "Acute? Rubbish!" Fuchsia dismissed the idea with a gesture of her tiny hand. "I'm not thinking of wigs or paint or such piffle. Say, have you never heard of the cocaine business?" "Oh, yes. Mr. Shafto is tremendously keen on the subject." "Pat Fitzgerald is mad about it, too, and is having a great big try to rope in the boss smugglers. He has told me the most terrible tales. Once the drug, it's cocaine and morphine mixed, gets a fast hold of a man or a woman, he or she is doomed." "Oh, Fuchsia, surely not so bad as that." "It's true. The poor thief to get a few annas to spend in the dens. The rich and educated buy it by stealth and absorb it at home in secret. What are the symptoms? Inquired Sophy. Have you ever seen anyone who took those drugs? Well, I could not say, she answered evasively, but I am aware that the symptoms are unaccountable drowsiness and lethargy, followed by a death-like sleep, and they say the most heavenly dreams. Later, the dreamer wakes up, haggard, feverish, and miserable. The skin has a dried, shrunken look, and you can always tell a drug taker by the eyes. The pupil is either as small as a pinpoint or else enormously enlarged. Fuchsia glanced sharply at Sophy, who was carefully manipulating a large bow. Was she recalling a domestic picture? Did any suspicion sink into her simple mind? If such was the case, the girl gave no sign. These drug maniacs' lives are a real burden, continued Fuchsia. They become indolent and slovenly. All they want in the whole world is more and more and more cocaine. The effect on some is to clear and stimulate the brain, and for a short time they seem superhuman. But soon this marvelous illumination that has flared up dies down like a fire of straw and leaves them nothing but the cold ashes. Fuchsia, said her companion, suddenly raising her head and gazing at her steadily, I believe you are thinking of someone. Why do you say that? Tell me who it is. But Fuchsia merely looked down on the ground and maintained an unusual silence. Do you know anyone that the cap fits? Persisted Sophy. Then, with a quick movement, she put the hat aside and, confronting her companion, said, Surely you don't mean Aunt Flora. Fuchsia's reply was a slow, deliberate nod. Oh, Fuchsia, this is too dreadful. How can you? Tell me why you have such a hideous suspicion. All right, then, I will. And Fuchsia sat bolt upright. I'm older than you are, and have knocked about the world a bit, and can't help seeing things that are thrust under my nose and drawing an inference. I must tell you that my grandfather was a notable lawyer, and who knows but that scrap of his mantle may not have descended upon me. Now, to answer your question right away, you will admit that pretty often your aunt is dressed like last year's scarecrow, that she is drowsy, stupefied, and generally inaccessible. At another time, she is real smart and vivacious, and puts other women in the shade. Then suddenly she disappears, shuts herself up along with Liliaya, and not a soul may approach her, no, not even you. Undoubtedly, Lily provides the drug and is handsomely paid. I ask you to look at her jewels and her diamond nose ring. Your aunt refuses to see a doctor, for a doctor would diagnose her case the instant he set eyes on her. She also refuses to quit Rangoon. And why? Because she would be torn away from what is killing her inch by inch, and that is cocaine. By the time Fuchsia had ended this speech, Sophy's face was colorless, and, as she unconsciously stroked a piece of ribbon between her fingers, many facts in support of Fuchsia's verdict flocked into her brain and forced themselves upon her comprehension. She had a conviction that what her friend had just told her was neither more nor less than a dreadful truth. An instant of clear vision had come. Scales had fallen from her eyes. She recalled those strange excursions to Ashi's stifling den, the purchase of ivory so soon thrown aside. Undoubtedly, this collection of Netsuke's was a blind. Her aunt's real object was to procure drugs. I'm afraid this is an awful blow to you, Sophy, resumed Fuchsia, and you will think I had no business to crowd in, but it is best that you should have your eyes open before it's too late. What do you think yourself, dear? There was an agonizing pause. Self-deception was no longer possible. With an effort, she replied, I'm afraid what you have told me is terribly true, It was stupid of me not to have guessed at something of the sort. I see things clearly now that you have put them before my eyes. Many puzzles are explained. The reason Aunt Flora keeps herself isolated, the reason why she has no really intimate friends, the reason why she is so untidy in her dress at times and talks so strangely. I suppose Mr. Krause knows? No, replied Fuchsia with emphasis. I have watched him carefully, and I don't believe he has the faintest suspicion, any more than you had yourself. Your Aunts Aya and possibly the cook are fellow conspirators, and no doubt the cause of the Missis's long, strange illness is common talk in the compound. What can be done to cure it? Oh, Fuchsia, do advise me. If I were to offer you one piece of advice, you would not take it. Well, at least allow me to hear it. It is to clear out of the house altogether and return home. I shall certainly not take that advice. I was invited to Rangoon to be a companion to Aunt Flora, and the moment that I find she has something frightful to fight against is surely not the time for me to run away and leave her in the lurch. No, I shall stay here and do what I can. Ah, if you only could. But, my dear girl, I am afraid it's too late. I have been questioning Pat Fitzgerald, of course without letting him know that I had any case in my mind's eye. From what I have gathered, Mrs. Krause has been taking this drug for a long time, and is past all help. Then do you mean, Fuchsia, that I am to sit by utterly helpless whilst my aunt slowly puts herself to death? Of course you might try various things. You could make it your business to find out and destroy the hypodermic syringe. Or perhaps your aunt takes it in pellets. I should interview the ayah and inform her you know the nature of her mistress's complaint. Threaten that you will tell Mr. Krause and have her discharged. I expect she gets enormous wages and has feathered her nest handsomely. If you could inveigle your aunt into taking a voyage to Australia, that might be of use. But these are just suggestions. In any way that I can help or back you up, I will. All the same, I must return to my first statement, which is, no matter how you strive and hope and fear, your effort will come too late. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Ann Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 31. Seeing is Believing. The recent Enlightenment had given Sophy a painful shock. Thoughts troublesome and insistent buzzed about her all day long and kept her awake at night. At first she had wept and abandoned herself to misery. Then she summoned her strength and will and made plans, hoping that she would have the courage to carry them out. She resolved to invade her aunt's bedroom and discover the true state of affairs. During the last 2 or 3 days, Mrs. Krause had withdrawn into seclusion, being threatened with one of her so-called attacks. On these occasions, no one but Lily was permitted to cross the threshold of her apartment. Late in the following evening, when the house was quiet and the servants had departed to their go-downs or the bazaar, and the Missy was supposed to have retired, Sophy slipped on a dressing gown and soft slippers and made her way into the anteroom, usually occupied in the daytime by her aunt, now dimly illuminated by one electric light. Before the door of the next apartment hung a heavy curtain which, when drawn aside, revealed a thick darkness, a peculiar odor, and the sound of rapid breathing. Sophy groped with her hand along the wall, found the switch, and the room and its contents were instantly revealed. A richly carved bedstead, a masterpiece of Burmese work, stood in the middle of the floor. At either side were small tables. one heaped with an untidy pile of books and magazines. On the other were bottles, glasses, and little boxes. In turning the switch, Sophy had lit the bulb, which hung directly over Mrs. Krause's couch, and there, by its pitiless glare, she lay fully exposed, sunken in a sleep resembling a swoon, her splendid black hair lying loose upon the pillows. She looked woefully old and shrunken. Her arms, displayed by an open-sleeved silk nightgown, were thin and strangely discolored. As Sophy stood surveying the scene, the bathroom door opened softly, and Lily stepped over the threshold. "Oh, my missy, whatever are you doing here?" she exclaimed, throwing up her hands. "I am searching for the hypodermic syringe by which you reduced my aunt," pointing to the bed, "to this horrible condition. Come with me, Lily." Leading the way to the outer room, "I have something to say to you." The ayah's face was almost green. She was shaking all over, but after a moment's hesitation she ultimately obeyed in sullen silence. "I was not aware until 2 days ago," resumed Sophy, "that my aunt took drugs, and that you supplied them." "I don't know what the missy is talking about," stammered Lily. "Oh, yes, you understand, and Mr. Krause will understand. At present he has no idea of my aunt's real ailment." "Missy going to tell him?" "Well, if I am sent away to Madras and the drug taken from the missus, she will soon die, you will see." Lily's tone was more triumphant than regretful. "She will die anyway," rejoined Sophy, "and it were better that she should die in her senses than a drugged victim to cocaine. How long has this been going on?" 2, 3 years, maybe 4 years. 4 years, repeated Sophy incredulously. "Yes, Mrs. plenty sick. No sleep getting. Doctor ordering small dose sleep mixture. Mrs. liking too much, taking more and more and more." "And you have her supplied. You get it from Washi?" "If not me, then some other woman. I plenty fond of Mrs. and I kept her secret." "And no doubt she has paid you well." "Yes, giving money, but too much trouble to get morphia and cocaine, and to keep people from talk. 1 or 2 times she took too big dose, and then nearly die. But Mrs. will have it all the same, die or no die." "Well now, if I promise you one thing, will you promise me another? I will not say a word to Mr. Krause, if you will agree to buy no more cocaine." "I will promise not to give so much, but no more cocaine taking at all, Mrs. would shrivel up and go out like one bit of paper in a candle. I will do what I can, missy, but Mrs. is always taking plenty. 2 grains is nothing." "I am astonished," said Sophy, "that my aunt has never been suspected of taking drugs." "Missy, you never suspect it yourself, and yet you have lived in same house for 15 months. It is hard to keep it dark, but all the servants know. Of course that is no matter, and as for the big memsahibs, they do not come here now." "It seems so strange," said Sophy, "that my aunt should have sunk into the state, all through one little dose of morphia." "Well, you see, missy, she was ill. It was in the rains. She was awfully melancholy and depressed, and she had not much to fill her mind. She did not sew or ride or make music like you do. Mr. Krause was away. She was sick and lonely, and so she got the doctor's prescription made up over and over again. If she could have gone to Europe 2 years ago, she might have cured herself of taking the stuff. 2, 3 times she has begun to stop it, but it was no good. I have talked to her and given her wise words and tried to help her and cheat her, but she always found me out. So all I can do or have done is to stand between her and the other memsahibs and hide her trouble." The sound of light footsteps stealing across the veranda caused Lily to pause. Then she added under her breath, "It is that Moti Aya, missy. She very cunning, same like little snake, and we had better go. I will keep my promise, though it will be plenty bother. I am glad that you know, for it will make business more easy for me now there is one less to hide it from." Thus the conspirators parted, Sophy having maintained from first to last her mastery of the situation. It was not long before Mrs. Krause became aware, more by instinct than actual knowledge, that her niece had discovered the real cause of her illness. One evening, as Sophy bent over to kiss her and say good night, she took her hand in both of hers and, with tears trickling down her face, whispered, "Sophy, darling, I've tried. It's no use. Whatever happens, keep it from him." And that was the sole occasion on which Aunt Flora ever alluded to her failing. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Mary Ann Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 32. On Duty. The veil that shrouded her aunt's secret being now withdrawn, by a strange paradox, a heavy cloud of darkness descended upon Sophy. She seemed to have suddenly passed from a warm glow of sunlight into a cold shadowland of mystery and fear. Before Herr Krause and the outer world, she still carried a buoyant standard of false high spirits. Her rippling laughter and cheerful repartees were to be heard where young people were assembled at the gymkhana or elsewhere, but this Sophy wore another aspect when she sat on duty in her aunt's bedroom, whiling away restless and want of sleep with reading and talk and even cards. Many a time the dawn was breaking before she was at liberty to go to bed. No wonder that she looked pale and fagged. No wonder people gazed at her keenly and inquired about her health. It is not easy, even for a girl of 22, thus to burn the candle at both ends. Riding, dancing, and playing tennis in the daytime, and then sitting up half the night with a restless and fretful patient. It was this Sophy who conferred so long and earnestly with Lily Aya, respecting methods to be adopted, pretenses affected, infinitesimal doses exchanged for the usual amount, and the patient craftily beguiled. But it is almost impossible to beguile a person who is suffering from the fierce craving for a drug, and the want of her normal supply soon began to make itself apparent in Mrs. Krause, and there were not a few exhausting scenes. Sophy found it necessary to take her Aya Moti into her confidence, a humiliating obligation as it happened. Moti had always been in the secret, and among the three it was arranged that the mistress of the house was to be watched and never left alone. Occasionally Mrs. Krause had disputes and dreadful altercations with Lily, but by degrees she appeared to acquiesce. Her strength was unequal to prolonged struggle, and the victim of cocaine would throw herself down on her bed and moan like some dying animal. These moans pierced the heart of her unhappy niece. Herr Krause was seldom at home, but when in residence his personality obtruded itself in all directions, and it was surprising to Sophy that he never noticed any cause for anxiety in his wife's appearance. She looked so ill and emaciated. It was true that he was preoccupied with important affairs, and that he only saw her of an evening when the lights were shaded. She still appeared in the afternoon and at dinner, particularly if they were alone. When she received visitors, especially her German neighbors, Sophy felt exceedingly uncomfortable. It seemed to her, although this might be imagination, that the ladies exchanged coughs and significant glances, and noticed the trembling hand with which Mrs. Krause helped herself to cake, her sudden lapses into silence, her abrupt interruptions and cavernous yawns. For years Mrs. Krause had been at home once a week to her German neighbors. They are a gregarious nation, and the Kaffeegesellschaft, an afternoon affair, beginning at 4 o'clock, is greatly beloved by German women. Here they enjoyed strong coffee, chocolate flavored with vanilla and whipped cream, and every description of rich cake. These coffee parties are generally an orgy of scandal, and that at Heidelberg was no exception. Whether Mrs. Krause was well or ill, the guests never failed to arrive. It was a standing institution, and enjoyed their approval and countenance. One bright hope upheld Sophy. Herr Krause now talked of returning home, that is, to Germany. "Business is booming, my dear old lady. I shall close down, and we will all depart. You have been in Burma too long, but in 6 months we shall be aboard the mail boat and watch the gold pagoda gradually sinking out of sight. I shall take a handsome place in the neighborhood of Frankfurt and entertain all my good friends. Then we will make music and eat, drink, and be merry." His talk was invariably in this hopeful strain. He never exhibited the least anxiety with regard to his wife's illness. It had become her normal condition, and he spoke of it as the confounded neuralgia, and cursed the Burmese climate. Sophy listened and marveled, and yet she herself had been equally dense. Neuralgia covers various infirmities, just as the cloak of charity covers a multitude of sins. She had become excessively sensitive and suspicious, a sort of domestic detective, a post that was by no means to her taste. She had thought long and earnestly over the situation, and from her reflections emerged the solid word, duty. It was her duty to fight for her aunt, to contend against the demon drug, and fight she did. Oh, if she could only maintain the struggle until her charge was en route home, what a victory! Mrs. Krause never alluded to her illness, a remarkable contrast to many invalids, but one afternoon, as Sophy sat beside her in the dimly lit lounge, she suddenly broke an unusually long silence. "Life is very difficult, Sophy, my dear. Death is easy, and I shall soon know all about it." "Oh, Aunt Flo, why do you say this?" "Because before long I shall die. Karl is full of great plans and talks of our wonderful future. I see no future for myself in Europe. I shall remain behind when you and he go down the Irrawaddy. But I am not afraid. On the contrary, I look forward." "As for death, I hope you are mistaken, Aunt Flora, but I confess that yours is a most enviable frame of mind." "It is, dear, I suppose. From living so long in the East, I have imbibed some of the people's ideas. In all the world these Burmans cannot be matched for their radiant cheerfulness. They make the best of the present, and, as they say, merely die to live again. There is not one of them who does not believe in and speak of his past life, and look forward to a future existence. This is why they wear such an air of happiness and contentment." "And do you really believe there is anything in this comfortable faith, Aunt Flora?" "Yes, my dear. I have a sincere confidence that my soul, not this miserable, wicked body, will live again and be given an opportunity of being better in another world." "Well, at any rate, that is a consoling creed. For my own part, I know little about Buddhism, but I can see that the Burmans are a religious people, much given to worship and offerings, and with a good deal of gaiety in their ceremonies. But Aunt Flora, although they are delightfully picturesque, and so merry and cheerful as a mass, they are terribly pleasure-loving and lazy. No Burman will work if he can help it. Even the women are difficult to get a hold of. Mrs. Blake, who is in the district, told me that her ayah, who never exerted herself, had put in for a year's holiday and rest." "But what had that to do with religion, my dear?" "Just this, that they are, as a race, too indolent and easygoing to study any big question or to take the trouble to think for themselves." But what about the hundreds and thousands of holy priests who spend all their lives in profound meditation? What do you say to that? Come now. I say they live a life of incorrigible idleness. They have no need to maintain themselves. They just eat and sit and muse. Everything is supplied to them, including their yellow robe and betel nut. Their religion is selfish. Well, well, I'm too stupid to argue, my dear child. My brain is like cotton wool. But I have my hopes, my sure hopes. Carl is different. He is cultured. He reads Marx and Hegel and says we are like cabbages and have no future. When we go, it is as a candle that is blown out. Oh, here are visitors. What a bore. I shall not appear. Run and tell the bearer. Oh, but these are your own special old friends, Mrs. Van Sittart and Mrs. Dowler. Do let them come in. They will amuse you. Poor dears, you know they always call after dark. These visitors, friends of former days, were social derelicts, who had, so to speak, gone ashore in Rangoon. One was chained to Burma by dire poverty and a drunken husband. The other, who had been a wealthy woman of considerable local importance, was now a childless widow, supporting herself with difficulty by means of a second-rate boarding-house. To these old friends, and in many other cases, Mrs. Krause had proved a generous and tactful helper. Both visitors were wearing costumes which had been worn and admired at Heidelberg, and were still fairly presentable. After a stay of an hour, the ladies withdrew, leaving their hostess well entertained, but completely exhausted. Then they hastily sought out Sophy in order to express to her in private their horror at the terrible change in her aunt. "Her spirit is there, all right," said Mrs. Dowler, who had a 100-rupee note in her glove. "But oh, my dear Miss Lee, how she's wasted! I felt like crying all the time I was sitting with her." "Yes, she should see a doctor, and that this very day," added Mrs. Van Sittart. "Oh, but you know Aunt Flora," protested Sophy. "She cannot bear doctors, and Lily, her ayah, knows pretty well what to do." "Tell me, Miss Lee, what is the real truth about your aunt's illness?" said Mrs. Dowler, suddenly dropping her voice to a mysterious whisper. "It has been so long and so tedious, off and on, for at least 3 years. She has been worse the last 4 months, and indeed ever since you went up to Mamio. It is not a malignant growth, please God. Oh no, nothing of that sort, just weakness in this relaxing climate." "She should have returned home years ago," said Mrs. Van Sittart. "And when she does go, oh, it will be a bad day and a sad day for me and many others, not to speak of all the animals she has befriended. She is wonderfully sympathetic to dumb creatures, and indeed to everybody." "That's true," echoed her companion. "No one knows of your aunt's good deeds and charities, not even her own servants, and that is saying everything. Her hand has raised many an unfortunate out of the dust." Thus whispering, advising, and hoping and bemoaning, the two ladies were conducted by Sophy to their jointly hired tickagari, and they were presently rattled away. Sophy, too, had her own particular visitors: Mabel Pomeroy, Mrs. Gregory, and Fuchsia. Fuchsia almost daily. To her it seemed that Sophy's confidences were frozen. She rarely mentioned her aunt and gave evasive answers to her friend's probing inquiries. At last the brave American spoke out. "You are frightfully changed, my Sophy girl, changed in a month. You have become so dull and absent-minded and have lost all your pretty color. Of course I know the reason, but you can do no good. No, not a scrap. You had much better have gone home when you discovered the secret. You are as thin as a walking stick and look as if you sat up all night and never went to bed." "Well, even if I did, and mind you, I'm not saying that I do, it is no worse for my health than dancing all night, is it? I'm very fond of Aunt Flora, and I'd do more than that for her." "She has added years to your life. The gay flitting about Sophy, with her pretty kittenish ways and harmless claws, has been thrust in a sack and drowned. "Well, I do think you might have given her a Christian burial," protested Sophy with a laugh. "Christian burial brings me to the marriage service. What do you think? That great stupid Irishman has at last blundered out a proposal. And in me," she said, rising and making a curtsy, "you behold the future Mrs. Patrick Fitzgerald." "Oh, Fuchsia!" jumping up to embrace her, "I do congratulate you, and I do hope you'll be very happy." "Yes, I believe we shall. I have money, and he—" She hesitated, and Sophy added, "has a warm, kind heart." "Oh, well, I was about to say looks, but I'll throw in the heart as well. Next week I'm going up to Calcutta to see about the trousseau and business. I'm really sorry to be the means of smashing up the Chummery Quartet." "And when does the blow fall?" "Not for some time. Patsy has asked for a long day." "Fuchsia! Well, no, it's not that. But he's obliged to finish some inspections. He really is fond of me. I dare say he's not as fond of me as Shafto is of someone, but his is a more serious, rigid character. If someone would smile, he would melt like a shovelful of snow on a coal fire. My dear Fuchsia, do give your imagination a rest. Maybe you're right, and my tongue too. I've only just one more thing to say." She paused and walked into the veranda in silence. In silence, Sophy followed her down to the car, and as she tucked in the knee sheet, she raised her eyes and asked, "What is this wonderful last word?" "That I think Sophy Shafto would be a nice, easy name to say." In another second, Fuchsia's car had panted away, and nothing remained of her visit but a cloud of red dust. End of chapter 32.
Chapter 33 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Sophy. Sophy had a difficult part to act. In fact, no less than 3 separate roles. One with her aunt, one with Herr Krause, and a third in public. Those who saw Miss Lee dancing and playing tennis at the gymkhana little guessed how she spent the remainder of the day, soothing and interesting a fretful invalid, or sitting up half the night on duty and on guard. Herr Krause was frequently from home, being incessantly engaged in winding up his affairs. Business took him 1 week to Moulmein, the next to Calcutta. This fat, elderly man displayed a sort of volcanic energy. He lived in a fever of repressed excitement and scarcely gave himself time to gobble his huge meals. Numbers of people, principally natives, pressed for interviews. 1 or 2 arrived in fine motor cars. Evidently, it was not a European business that appeared to absorb all his time and faculties. However, whatever his nationality, Herr Krause was happy and exultant. There was an expression of assured triumph upon his frog-like visage. Naturally, this triple life left its mark on Sophy, though she kept her miseries and responsibilities to herself. Mrs. Gregory and other friends put their heads together and decided that she looked ill and careworn, and the ever active Fuchsia laid certain information before Shafto, with the result that the following day he arrived at Heidelberg to make a formal call. Of late he found that he could never have a word with Miss Lee. She rarely rode in the morning and was seldom to be seen at the gymkhana, and so he, as Fuchsia had suggested, bearded the lioness in her den. That is, he called at Heidelberg between the orthodox hours of 4 and 5. This is very formal, exclaimed Sophy, as he entered the somewhat dusky drawing room. Visiting hour and visiting card complete. What does it mean? It merely means that I wish to see you, replied Shaftu. I can never get a look in elsewhere. One would almost think that you avoided me and wanted to cut me. What a ridiculous idea, she exclaimed, sitting down and motioning him to a chair. Well, it does seem ridiculous that we see so very little of you. I hope you are not ill. No, indeed. Why should I be ill? Do I look like an invalid? Since you ask me, I don't think you seem particularly fit. How is Mrs. Crouse? Oh, much the same. Sometimes she is able to be out in the car and sits in the veranda. Other days she cannot appear at all. And you and Herr Crouse are tete-a-tete? How do you get on together? Oh, pretty well. I only see him at breakfast and dinner, and we talk about food and cooking and the servants. It's all right when he is alone, but when he brings friends to dinner, it is rather disagreeable. I understand German now, and am able to make out the hateful things they say about us as a nation. Naturally, I stick up for my own country. I talk to them in English. They gabble to me in German, and we make an awful clatter. Herr Crouse looks on, or joins in, and roars and bangs the table. I am fighting 1 to 5, and with my back to the wall. They are full of facts that I cannot dispute, not being posted up in statistics. When I attempt to bring forward our side, they interrupt and shout me down. Now we have declared open war. Last night, I got up and left them in possession of the field, and I have told Herr Crouse that the next time he has a session, I prefer to dine alone. He treats it as a splendid joke and says I am silly, ignorant backfish. Of course, a lot of it is trade envy, said Shaftu, but the German, to give them their due, are energetic, thrifty, and pushing, and are taking places in the sun all over the world. Have you heard from Miss Millward lately? No, not for some weeks. She writes such amusing letters. So I should imagine. She has a wonderfully elastic mind, and says and does the very thing that comes into her head. Do you remember one day on the Bankshire when, half in joke, she said we were 2 young lambs about to be turned out in strange and unknown pastures, and if one of us got into any difficulty, the other was bound to help? Yes, I remember perfectly well. It was after Mr. Jones, the missionary, had been giving us a lecture on what he called pitfalls in the East. Well, now I warn you that I'm going to be officious and interfering. I have a notion that you are in some difficulty. What Mrs. Millward said in joke, I repeat in deadly earnest. If you are in any sort of hole, let me lend a hand. But why should you imagine that I am in any difficulty, or as you call it, a hole? Sophy tried to carry it off gaily, but her eyes fell. Because you look so changed and depressed, and seem to have lost your spirits. Perhaps as you have no bodily ailment, there is something on your mind? And who can minister to a mind diseased? She quoted with a smile. No, I'm really normal and absolutely sane. I wish you wouldn't put me off, he protested. I know there is something. Even if there were, do you expect me to make you my father confessor? No, indeed, but I do think you might give us a hint, I mean your friends, of what it is that has come between us. For a moment she found it difficult to answer. At last she said, well, there is something, I admit, something that claims all my time. I am sorry I cannot tell you more, for it is not my own secret. I see, it belongs to another. Evidently, Sophy had discovered the truth at last, a truth that was withering her youth and crushing her to the earth. His quick eye understood the signs of strain and fatigue. All life and light had faded from her face, and he realized that she was, as Fuchsia had described, terribly changed. For a moment neither of them spoke. She fidgeted with a turquoise ring. It was much too loose, or her fingers were much too thin, for it suddenly slipped, dropped into her lap, and then rolled far away upon the floor with an air of impudent independence. Shaftu, as he searched for and picked up this ring, felt something forcing and driving him to speak, and after a moment's reflection, he made up his mind to dare all. I believe I know your secret, was his bold announcement, as he restored her property. You, she ejaculated, that is impossible. At least I can guess, he said, dropping his voice. Then he got up, and standing before her with his hands in his pockets, looked down at her steadily and continued, it has to do with a drug. At the word drug, she winced visibly, and her pale face changed. The drug is cocaine, he went on slowly, and the victim is a lady in this house. Sophie's white cheeks were now aflame. Bright tears stood in her eyes. She was passing through a painful crisis. To assent would amount to a betrayal. Should she put him off with a lie? There seemed to be an interminable pause before she spoke. Why do you say this to me? She asked in a low voice. Fitzgerald has means of finding out curious facts, and sometimes he tumbles into a thing by accident. He is mad keen to scotch this cocaine business, and incidentally discovered that one of Ah She's best customers was, you know who. She has been procuring the stuff for the last 3 years. I believe you have only recently found out the hideous fact, and this accounts for what anyone can see with half an eye. Your look of care and anxiety. I am well aware that I have undertaken a dangerous mission in coming here to tell you this. Possibly you may never speak to me again, but I take the risk because I do want to so very, very badly be of some use and to stand by you. There was nothing for it but to accept the situation, and at last she said, the only way in which you can help me is by keeping silent. How long have you known? About 6 weeks. So now I understand why we see you so seldom at tennis or the paper chases. Yes, and now you do understand. Perhaps you will help me and put people off when they ask tiresome questions. She spoke with a catch in her voice. I scarcely ever leave my aunt. I read and talk and play the piano and do my best to keep her amused. I am very fond of Aunt Flora. You must be, he exclaimed sharply. But indeed, She is not so much to blame as you suppose. Think of her loneliness and illness. Years of this relaxing climate and intense depression tempted her to seek relief, and once she had touched the drug, it gripped her like a vice and made her a prisoner. Whom you are struggling to release. Does Herr Kraus know? No, he has no suspicion. No more had I till recently. Lily, Mr. Fitzgerald, you and I are all that are in the secret. It is much too heavy a load for your shoulders. Won't you tell Mrs. Gregory? She is so practical and so safe, and full of clever expedients and energy. No, I shall not open my lips. How could I? Mrs. Gregory is my loyal and kind friend, but once I began to take people into my confidence, I could never tell where it would end. Soon it might be all over Rangoon that my aunt takes drugs. As it is, I am making a little headway. We have diminished the quality, and I have greater hopes that the craving is less. Of course, I am obliged always to be on guard. That is why I am so rarely able to leave home. Herr Kraus talks of retiring in 4 months, and if I can only keep Aunt Flora safe until then, the day of our departure means the day of her escape. And now, please let us talk of something more cheerful. I suppose you have heard about your friend, Mr. Fitzgerald, and Miss Bliss? And she threw him a charming, confidential smile. Oh, yes, rather. Fitzgerald was in the most awful funk and talked of writing his proposal, but I choked him off and told him that it was a cowardly way of putting his fate to the touch. The telephone would have been better, and that he must face the music like a man. You wouldn't be in the least nervous in similar circumstances? No, honestly, I would not. If I believed the girl cared 2 straws about me, anyone that wasn't stone blind could see that Miss Bliss liked Fitzgerald. He is a rattling good sort, and I believe they will suit one another splendidly. But Shafto had not come to Heidelberg to discuss Fitzgerald and his affairs. He wanted to talk to Sophy about herself. I do wish you would confide in Mrs. Gregory, he urged. She is a tower of strength. I don't think you are strong enough to tackle the situation here. Oh, yes, I am, she answered, rising. It's just a question of willpower and holding out. It was good of you to come like this, but now I'm afraid I must send you away. This is the time I always sit with my aunt. As she spoke, she approached nearer to the long glass door, and coming out of the gloom of the drawing room, he saw by the unsparing light the startling alteration in her appearance. She looked so thin and worn, her eyes so large, her face so small, her whole appearance wilted. When he thought of Mrs. Kraus, with her deadly secret, her vampire hold on this girl, then of Kraus and his secret, he could no longer restrain himself. All these influences which stir the deepest emotions of the heart were silently operating on Shafto's. His face assumed a set expression and had grown suddenly pale. Sophy, he exclaimed. The word sent her heart galloping. I am sure you know that. I adore you, but somehow I've never ventured to tell you this till now. He paused as if the words stuck in his throat, and meanwhile a huge brown insect of the bee tribe entered, booming alarmingly and knocking itself about the room. But now I've got to speak out and take risks. There is a terrible cloud over this house, a cloud of shame. I know I am saying all this most awfully badly, but I ask you to let me take you away from Heidelberg. He broke off abruptly and stood looking into her eyes. Sophy, no longer pale, returned his gaze steadily. It was not now a question of her aunt's secret, but of her own future. She cared very much for her companion. Why deceive herself? And with the instinct common to her sex, had been aware of his feelings for a long time. All the same, she could not desert her post. She put up her thin hand. It was trembling. Shaftu could see, with a gesture of one who was thrusting aside temptation. I don't understand about the cloud, but even so my place is here. Surely you will see that. And I am, all the same, very grateful. Her voice shook and sank almost to a whisper. I'm glad that you care for me. At this moment, a curtain was hastily swung aside, and Lily appeared. Missy, the Mem Sahib asking for you now. Please to come quickly. And with a swift glance at her, Missy obeyed. The purdah fell heavily behind her slim white finger, and Shaftu was alone. His mission had been fruitless, and yet when he rode away from Heidelberg, in his heart he carried the flower of hope. End of chapter 33. Section 34 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. All is over. That same evening, as Sophy was sitting alone in the veranda after dinner, Lily Aya appeared, her fat arms uplifted in eloquent appeal. Oh, Missy, you come with me. I think our Mem Sahib soon die. Die? Exclaimed Sophy, springing to her feet. Yes, somehow these drug people are too clever. She has got cocaine. I think that waterman bring it. Anyhow, Mem Sahib has taken one big dose, and lies as one gone from the world. Send at once for Herr Kraus. He is in his office. And Sophy ran towards her aunt's room and found, as Lily had described, that her relative was passing away. Indeed, save for her faint breathing, one would have supposed that she had already crossed the border. Herr Kraus cast one hurried glance, thundered out of the room, and rang up the telephone. Then he returned and stood gazing at his wife, his face working with emotion. What has happened? He asked, turned abruptly to Sophy. Why is she like this? What does it mean? I cannot tell, a reply which could be taken in two ways. It must have been some sudden attack. Her heart, I suppose. Marling, the nearest doctor, will be here instantly. And as he spoke, a square-shouldered, severe-looking man entered. Without a word, but in a most business-like manner, he made an examination of the patient, felt her pulse, turned back her eyelids, and then ejaculated an ominous, "Ha!" "What is it?" inquired Kraus. What is the matter with my wife? Is it serious? Don't you know? Demanded the doctor, turning on him sharply. It is cocaine poisoning, the last stage. Cocaine? Echoed Kraus, and his large buff-colored face turned to a leaden hue. You are mistaken. That is not possible. Well, if you don't believe me, get another opinion, retorted the doctor brusquely. Judging from the slight examination I have made, your wife has been taking the drug for years. Impossible, almost shouted Kraus. Not at all, rejoined the doctor. Cocaine has been poisoning people in Rangoon by hundreds. Mrs. Kraus is not the only victim. Kraus, great heavy man that he was now trembling so violently that he was obliged to lean against the wall for support, and, pointing to the bed, he said, I had not the slightest suspicion. God beware, I had not. I thought her ailment was neuralgia. I will pay any money, no matter what fee. Surely you can do something for her. I'm afraid not. Mrs. Kraus is beyond help and can never recover consciousness. She has been taking quantities of the drug for a long time. Look at her arm, turning back the sleeve and revealing an emaciated, telltale limb. Did you know? Said Kraus, appealing to Sophy, who stood at the other side of the bed. The words came in short, savage jerks. Yes, she replied. I only discovered it 6 weeks ago. And never told me? Glaring at her with furious expression. No, because Aunt Flora implored me to be silent. I was doing my best to stop it and minimizing the doses. Ah, exclaimed the doctor, that accounts for this. She has been starved and, with the cunning of these morphia maniacs, found means to get a supply and has absorbed an enormous quantity. Ah, God, it seems incredible, moaned Kraus, now rising and coming towards the bed and lifting his wife's limp hand. What could have made her take to it? Illness, loneliness, depression, this enerving climate, having nothing particular to do. An idle woman of 40 has no business in Burma. But surely you have some remedy, something that will bring her to. Gott in Himmel! You don't tell me that she will never see me or speak to me again? No, cocaine is one of the most powerful drugs, the greatest curse in our pharmacopoeia. It is better that she should go like this. Even if she were to survive a week, she would be a mere inanimate shadow. Oh, my poor Flora, my heart's joy. You must not go. You shall not leave me without one word. And Herr Kraus tumbled down upon his knees and sobbed stertorously. The doctor, who was surveying him with frigid amazement, suddenly turned and, seizing Sophy by the arm, said, You can do no good here now. This is no place for you. Leading her to the door, he closed it inexorably behind her. Half an hour later, she was joined by Lily, her round face wet with tears. All is over now, Miss Sahib. My missus always so good to me. My missus done die. End of section 34.
Section 35 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marianne Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 35. Mung Baw Lies Low. In some mysterious manner, the cause of Mrs. Krause's death was hushed up. There was no inquest, and the announcement in the Rangoon Gazette merely stated, "On the 8th inst., Flora, the beloved wife of Herr Karl Krause, suddenly, of heart failure." Sophy had been carried off to the barn a few hours after her aunt had passed away, and never again entered Heidelberg. The funeral was large, expensive, and imposing, and included a crowd of rather unexpected and decidedly shabby mourners, who brought with them offerings of cheap, homemade wreaths and crosses, and wore faces of sincere and unaffected grief. Strange to say, the grave prepared to receive Mrs. Krause was next to that in which lay the remains of Richard Roscoe. The two cocaine victims rested side by side in death, drawn together by the long arm of coincidence. It had been decided that Sophy was to remain at the barn and accompany Mrs. Gregory when she went home in August. She quickly recovered her looks and spirits amid bright society and cheerful surroundings. There had been an auction at Heidelberg. Everything was disposed of. The accumulation of 12 years was scattered to the winds, the servants were disbanded, and the house was closed. Herr Krause sent Sophy a quantity of his wife's jewels, with a letter thanking her for all her care and attention. But she only retained a ring that had been worn daily by her aunt, and returned the remainder, which was afterwards disposed of in Balthasar's sale rooms, and fetched a handsome sum. It was said that Herr Krause had felt his wife's death acutely. He had left Rangoon without the ceremony of farewells, departing no one knew whither. Time slipped by, and so far had brought no trace of the cocaine gang. On several occasions, Shafto had ridden round by the big kyung behind the turtle tank, and met with no success, nothing but a shake of the Pongyi's shaven head. On his first visit he had dismounted, given his horse to its syce, and boldly approached the monastery, outside of which an imposing group of Pongyis was assembled. The attitude of some was lofty and disdainful. Others, with a friendly glance, acknowledged the stranger's ceremonious greeting. Towering majestically among his fellows stood Mung Baw, who, throwing them a hasty explanation, advanced to welcome Shafto with a soldierly tread and a jaunty swing of his yellow robe. Then, taking him aside, he began to talk to him in a cautious undertone. "I am sorry to tell you I have no cubber yet. If I had some female acquaintance, it would be so easy as kiss my hand. But I cannot break my vow or spake to a woman. So you have no clue? There's dozens of clues, if I could get hold of one. That's what aggravates me and has me tormented. But I'll worry it out yet, and that's as sure as me name is McRyan." "I thought it was Mung Baw." "So 'tis mostly and officially, but this business I'm on is a white man's job, and if it's to be done, I'll do it." As he spoke, he removed his clumsy horn spectacles, and Shafto realized that the eyes gazing unflinchingly into his own were those of an enthusiast, and possibly a hero. Seen in telltale daylight, and without his disfiguring glasses, the Pongyi looked years younger. Hitherto, Shafto's impression had been that his strange acquaintance was a man of 50. 35 would be nearer the mark. His eyes were a shade of deep indigo blue, with thick black lashes, high cheekbones, were possibly a legacy of Singalese grandmother. A square, well-shaped head, firmly set upon a fine pair of shoulders, a square chin and jaw, and a well-cut mouth with shining white teeth were his inheritance from the West. Undoubtedly, if Mung Baw's religion had not compelled him to sacrifice every hair on his body, including his eyebrows, he would have been an uncommonly good-looking fellow, but an absolutely bare face and bald cranium was a heavy handicap were he Apollo himself. At least thrice a week Shafto, in the character of a private inquiry officer, rode slowly round the kyong, and had a word or two with the tall, upstanding priest. One evening the latter beckoned to Shafto to dismount, and, leading him apart, assured him that he was creeping on at last. "As soon as I know what I think I know, I'll send you a bit of a chit. It's an awful traffic, this infernal trade, now I've seen into it. Cheek by jowl, these drugs is worse and crueler than wild animals, and we can't kill them." "No, worse luck," assented Shafto. "They kill us. I say, Mung Baw, don't your friends in the monastery wonder why I so often ride round this way and look you up?" "Oh, yes, some does be as curious as a cat in a strange larder, but I have it all explained to their satisfaction." Then, dropping his voice, he added mysteriously, "They think I'm convarting you." "What, to Buddhism?" And Shafto burst out laughing. "Fay, you might do worse." "Possibly, but I am all right as I am." "That's a good hearing. Well, I'm not for troubling anyone's mind, sure. Aren't we all, with the sweep of his powerful hand, striving to reach the same place? And if it's what I expect, I hope to meet ye. Where's the gong for prayers? And I must fall in." 2 days later, Shafto received a letter written in a neat clerkly hand. It said, "If you will be at the Great Godima in the woods beyond the turtle tank by 5 o'clock tomorrow, Tuesday, you may hear news. M.R." The Great Godima in the woods is a gigantic image in alabaster, encompassed by palm ferns and half clothed in flowering creepers. The day of this particular shrine has sunk below the horizon. Worshippers are absent, and the flowers laid around and about are entirely the contribution of nature herself. Some day the shrine will disappear altogether, buried like many others in appreciative vegetation. As Shafto approached the rendezvous, he saw the Pongyi seated on the steps, engrossed in a book with a red cover, which he hastily thrust into some inner pocket as he rose to his feet. "Ye might not think it, but I'm a great reader," he explained apologetically. "It passes the time and is no sin. The saints themselves were wonderful writers and readers. A friend here gets me books out of the public library, and then I borrow when I can." "What have you got hold of now?" inquired Shafto. "15 Decisive Battles of the World, and before that, Jungle Tales. I could tell a good few myself. Animals and birds does be very friendly and confidential with me, but it's not books I brought you here to talk about, but cocaine and opium." "Yes, rather. Have you got any news?" "I have so. I found out what I may call the head layer of the divils." "Good for you. How splendid. How did you manage it?" "Bedad, it was a terrible touch-and-go business, as you shall hear. You see, I should first explain how I get so much liberty to go mooching around the bazaars and wharves. Being for so long weak in the head, and also of another country, allowances are made, and I'm looked on as an oddity, yet well respected, for I'm clever with cures and language. Well, I used to poke about among a lot of scum that has no respect for any cloth whatever, no, for life itself, and all the time I felt in me bones I'd surely find what I wanted among a crew that's just the sweepings of creation. There was one particular low wharf I used to hang round by way of watching fellows netting fish, and one warm afternoon, as I was meditating there, the chance looked my way. 2 half-drunken Chinamen came along quarreling and sat down near me, and I foxed I was sound asleep. They argued about shares and money, and jabbered away very angry, telling me all I wanted. By and by, when they cooled down a bit, they saw me, and this was what ye may call a critical moment for Mick Ryan." "No doubt of that. Go on." "At first one of them was undecided as to whether I was asleep or not. The other brute said, 'No chance take. Stick knife in throat and shove into the water.' You know what these thieves are with their long blades. I tell ye, Mr. Shafto, they might have heard me heart thumping. However, my good angel St. Michael himself had his eye on me, for it turned out that neither of them had a doll with him. Then they come and leant over me, breathing into me face with their filthy rank breath, reeking of napey and pickled eggs, and I snored back like a good one. I snored for my very life, and I done it so natural they were well satisfied, and I, being such a big man and heavy to shift, they give up the notion of slinging me into the Irrawaddy and went off still quarreling. I stayed on without a move out of me for a full hour. Then I got up yawning my head off and walked away with the clue in me hand. Is the din in Rangoon? There's many a queer place here. No, not in Rangoon itself, but some way up the river. About 20 miles beyond Prome there is a deserted village that was cleared out by cholera 20 years ago. They say a big cholera gnat lives there, and no one will go next or nigh it. There's a pagoda, a kyung, and a rest house all smothered in jungle, and a nice little bit of convenient landing. And 'tis there the cocaine company does its business. I learnt all of their tricks. The Chinamen gave me lots of news. It seems they smuggle opium, too, and distribute the stuff up and down the river by boats, on land by pack animals and the railroad. Oh, it's a wonderfully handy situation. They couldn't have picked a better. And what about the people who run it? Asked Shafto. Well, the head of them all is gone. He was, as you may have suspicioned yourself, that fellow Kraus. No one knows what's become of him. Some say he's in Calcutta, more think he's dead, died aboard ship, but that may not be true. Them sort of ruffians generally live to a great age. Someone may have put him out, or rather done him in. There were 2 or 3 chaps that I've heard talking terrible bitter agin him, and one fine young man, Arbo, who is back from the Andamans, where he got sent to for 3 year on account of his cocaine business, told me that he met a lot of clever fellows from all parts of the world, up to every dodge they were, and one of them instructed him in the way of killing a man stone dead and not leaving a spot on him. I believe it's some little trick with the head, where it joins the spine. This chap confessed that he had tried it on several with success, and it wouldn't surprise me if he had made an experiment on Kraus. But what about the cocaine? Said Shafto. How are we to set about getting a haul? Ye'll have to go aisy, or rather Mr. Fitzgerald and the Poles must work by stealth, and he can take a good few disguised, as it were, on a sort of pilgrimage, but well armed, and passing through this village as it were accidental, and with a couple of boats on the river, I think they might scare the lot. I'd like to go with them meself, for a bit of sport. Only for me yellow robe, it wouldn't look so well for me to be seen mixed up with cocaine, thaves, and the Poles. No, I suppose not, agreed Shafto. You have to think of your cloth. Well, if you will write me down a few details on this slip of paper in my notebook, I will give it to Mr. Fitzgerald at once, and I can't tell you how thankful he will be to get hold of it, or how grateful to you we are. Oh, I don't want no thanks for what has been a real pleasure. Haven't I seen with me own 2 eyes all the terrible harm this drug taking leads to? And if I've been in a small way the means of putting a stop to some of it, I'll be a proud man. He paused to clear his throat and continued, I suppose you have not seen anything of Ma Chit lately? No. She keeps you from going to the Salters, doesn't she? She's always sitting about there on the steps, heartbroken, because she can't get a word with ye. Of course, I'm not surprised she took a fancy to ye. Fancy? Rot! Burst out Shafto. I can't stand these cheeky Burmese girls. I only hope I may never set eyes on Ma Chit again. Well then, as likely as not you won't, remarked Mung Baw soothingly. She has a rich relation up at Thayetmio, and she's swithering between love and money. Perhaps after all money will carry the day. Well now, I must be going to me duties and me devotions, and I'll bid ye good evening. The conversation at the Heidelberg, interrupted by Lily, had been resumed on a suitable occasion in the gardens of the barn, and Sophy and Shafto were now provisionally engaged. "I'm a wretched match for you, Sophy," he declared. "I don't believe your mother will allow it. I've no prospects." "Never mind prospects," was her reckless reply. "We shall have enough to live on. I have 100 a year of my own, and I am quite a good manager, with a real taste for millinery. If the worst comes to worst, I shall open a shop in Ferris Street and make our fortune." It was mail day, and Shafto, who now dined at the barn, was unusually late in appearing. He looked rather excited and out of himself as he entered with many apologies. After dinner he and Sophy paced the drive in the silver moonlight, and she began, "I could hardly sit still or read a morsel, for anyone could see that you were bursting with some great news. What is it?" "I have two pieces of news, and I'll give you first of all one that concerns ourselves. I saw in the mail some weeks ago that my uncle Julian Shafto was dead. He had no family and left no will, and I found a letter today at the office from a lawyer informing that I, being next of kin, am heir at law and succeeded to the property and a fairly large income." "Oh, Douglas, how splendid! It sounds too good to be true." "I never saw my uncle. He and my father had a disagreement before I was born, and had no communication with one another. He did not even send us a line when my father died. I fancy he was a hard-bitten old bachelor. I've not seen the family place, Shafton Court, and don't know much about it, except I remember my father saying there were one or two fine pictures, a fair library, and what did not interest him, first-rate partridge shooting." "Oh, what a piece of good fortune! Do let us go in at once and tell Polly." "But would you not like to hear my other piece of news, which is even better?" "It could not be better, but do tell me quickly." "Fitzgerald has brought off a splendid coup up the river, run in the cocaine gang and collared no end of drugs. He is to receive the thanks of the LG and the government reward." "How did he discover it?" "A man I know really put him on the track. The cocaine lair was in a village so deserted and tumble down and haunted that no one suspected it, or went near it. Upon Yi Kyong, said to be infested by malignant gnats and hundreds of snakes, was the head office. Rather a clever dodge." "Do you think this will put an end to the traffic?" "No, but it will give a tremendous setback. Where there is a demand, there will always be a supply, but for a considerable time, at least a year or two, cocaine will be scarce. They caught a good many of the small fry, but as usual the big fish escaped. All but one wealthy Mohammedan, but he is bound to wriggle out somehow. Another point in favor of the short supply of cocaine, the disappearance of Kraus." "What?" exclaimed Sophy. "Oh, Douglas, surely you don't mean he was in it?" "In it? I should think so, up to his neck." "Oh, but are you certain?" "Quite certain. This will explain his many mysterious journeys, the gangs of natives who were always hanging round his office, and his suspicious opulence. You may have noticed that he had no friends among the better class of Rangooner, whether British or German. They all suspected him of dirty hands. He had no conscience, and was absolutely unscrupulous. It was a strange nemesis that his wife, to whom you say he was devoted, should kill herself with the very drug he was smuggling." "Yes, poor Aunt Flora," murmured Sophy. "That is a dreadful tale, which I shall always keep from Mother. I think if she were to know it, it would nearly break her heart." End of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marianne Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 36. The Bombshell. In spite of the claims of his own affairs, Shafto did not immediately resign his post at Gregory's, for it happened to be an unusually busy season. There was a heavy paddy crop, and, owing to fever, the staff was short-handed. Therefore, for the present, he decided to stick to the ship, especially as Sophy was, so to speak, on board. Mrs. Gregory and Sophy were returning to England at the end of August. Naturally, he booked his passage for the same date, and it was a happy coincidence that he and his fiancée were once more to be shipmates on the Blankshire. Meanwhile, they were enjoying the time of their lives. The rides or strolls in the grounds or in Dalhousie Park, and dances at the club were delightful, and their world was sympathetic and smiled upon the engagement. Mrs. Gregory loved a wedding. Her rooms, appointments, and well-drilled staff readily lent themselves to such festivals. And why, she asked, should Sophy not be married from the barn? Take a trip up the river for her honeymoon in order to see something of the real country, and buy her trousseau after her arrival in London. Fired with this project, both she and Shafto dispatched long and plausible letters to Mrs. Lee. But Mrs. Lee declined to entertain the idea, and, in equally long and eloquent effusions, set forth the fact that she had seen nothing of her youngest daughter for nearly 2 years, and claimed a share of her company ere she was carried away to another home. She had, however, given a cordial assent to Sophy's engagement, and declared that she would gladly accept Douglas Shafto as the son, but Sophy must be married from home, and in the old church at Chelsea. As Mrs. Gregory returned this letter, she said, "Well, Sophy, you must only take a sort of pre-honeymoon tour. We will go up to Mandalay and maybe explore a bit of the Shan Hills. I shall coax George to come. He has not had a holiday for ages. Douglas must get a fortnight off duty, and Martin Kerr, our Donish old cousin, who is arriving from Calcutta in a day or two, may accompany us. He is a bachelor, very well off, and has lived all his life like a hermit crab in his college in Oxford. Lately he had a bad breakdown, and was ordered an immense rest and change. So now he has ventured out to blink at the universe beyond Carfax and the High, and I expect he will find us shamelessly trivial and ignorant. How his eyes will open when they look upon this glaring world and behold some glaring facts! I shall invite Miss Maitland to join our party. She is of a nice suitable age, and I shall pair her off with Martin. We will take George's Derwan as courier, for he has Upper Burma at his finger ends, and will see that we are comfortable." The projected tour proved entirely successful. Mandalay was reached in 30 hours. From Mandalay, after a few days' halt, the explorers fared to farther and less trodden fields, visited the ruby mines, and the wonderful remains of Pagan. Occasionally they found the accommodation at zayats, or rest houses, a little rough, but this was handsomely discounted by novel sights and experiences, a full view of the Burman at home, and the easy joys of village life. First of all, there was the morning procession of stately Pongyees, carrying their empty begging bowls, and looking neither to the right nor left. There were delicious hours in the forests, boating and fishing expeditions on the rivers, or rides to the ruins of ancient cities, half buried in jungle. Shafto and Sophy saw so many novelties that they were almost bewildered, but not nearly so much bewildered or impressed as was the professor when first introduced to the library of an ancient monastery, in comparison with whose age his beloved Bodleian was a mere infant. Here the volumes were written on palm leaves, then rubbed over with oil to toughen and preserve them. The edges were richly gilt and fastened together by drilling a hole at one end, through which a cord was passed. Then they were placed in elaborate lacquer boxes. There were countless numbers of such books, devout and mystic, all inscribed in Pali. They included the 3 Baskets of the Law, also the Laws of Manu, which dated from the 5th century before Christ. professional scribes were kept constantly employed in recopying and restoring these precious tomes, as the palm leaves only last about 100 years, after which they become brittle and difficult to decipher, and the copyists have an endless task. The professor, attended by an interpreter, haunted the library, made eloquent signs to the Pongese in charge, and was permitted to examine and make notes of the rarest of their frail treasures, for which favor he duly made a generous acknowledgment. Thanks to Mr. Gregory's courier, the travelers found comfortable quarters in his own ancestral village, and there they were able to watch the inhabitants both at work and play. They saw the oxen treading out grain, men working an oil mill or caging fish, women weaving gay material, and children plaiting straw mats. So much for daytime occupations. At night there were songs, dancings, gamblings, and games. These included chess, played somewhat differently from what it is in Europe, but still the same chess as when it crossed the frontiers from China. There was a king, but instead of a queen, a general. Instead of bishops, elephants, and some of the moves were unusual. Mr. Gregory, who rather fancied himself as a chess player, boldly challenged one of the elders, and with the entire village as solemn spectators, suffered, alas, a humiliating defeat. Then Shafto took a hand at dominoes, at which, thanks to Mei Li, he was an expert. Fortunately, he came off conqueror, and thus restored to some extent the credit of the party. These games were played by torchlight. The local band, harp, dulcimer, 2 drums, and clappers, discoursed at intervals. Here the inhabitants, unlike those of Rangoon, were early birds. By 10 o'clock the lights were extinguished, the crowd had dispersed, and a serene silence fell on the soft purple night. The college don had thoroughly enjoyed his excursion into primitive life in Upper Burma. He also enjoyed the stimulating company of Miss Maitland, and in this delightful, highly colored atmosphere, surrounded by agreeable companions, he fished, joked, flirted, and appeared to have shed his formal Oxford manner, along with his Oxford trencher and gown. He remembered Shafto's father, and, on the strength of this memory, the two became excellent friends, and Shafto gave him assistance in the way of adjusting his puttees, helping him over awkward places, advising him what food to avoid and what insects to destroy. The trip lasted for 3 weeks, and the party returned to Rangoon delighted with their tour, and bringing with them quantities of snapshots, not a few small trophies and mementos, which included the great Shan hat purchased by the professor, and amusing anecdotes of their varied adventures. "I feel as if I'd had a bird's-eye view of the real country," said Sophy to her friend. "Those great calm seas of green rice, bounded by dark wood, with a white pagoda peeping through here and there, the fierce strong rivers flowing through overhanging forests, and the deep red sunsets turning old ruins into flames, and then the golden days and silver nights, and all the nice, friendly, simple people. Douglas and I feel quite sad at the idea of saying goodbye to Burma." "Well, my dear, the matter lies in your own hands," said Mrs. Gregory briskly, "and after you are married, you can return to Rangoon. There is a fine big empty house in Halpin Road. We might go over and inspect it some morning." The assassination of the heir to the crown of Austria and his duchess had caused a profound sensation in Europe. Ripples of this far-reaching tragedy had spread to the east. The Rangoon bazaar, like every other bazaar, was full of thrilling whispers, and various prudent traders were figuratively drawing in their horns and preparing for big trouble across the Kanipali. It was the first week in August, and on Wednesday there had been a breakneck and exciting paper chase with the finish at Government House. Here a profusion of refreshments was displayed, and all the world more or less was present, the men drinking pegs, the ladies iced coffee, gossiping, discussing the recent performance, and various local matters. All at once, a government peon ran quickly through the crowd, a telegraph peon. Then a motor arrived with two men, officials, who had not taken part in the paper chase. Sir Horace Winter, the lieutenant governor, and his military secretary disappeared abruptly indoors, and there was a sudden pause in the continuous chatter. More than one of the guests experienced a curious thrill, as if there was something electric in the air. Then, from nowhere in particular, the word war was whispered. Great Britain has declared war on Germany. This seemed incredible. People stared at one another, aghast, and boldly declared that it was just a bazaar shave and a mistake. For out in the far, far east, there had been no preliminary muttering of the storm which was about to burst and drown half the world in tears. Nevertheless, the news was horribly true. War had come. War, after so many years of European peace and prosperity. And newly aroused, startled countries found themselves face to face with the malignity of the unknown. Presently the lieutenant governor reappeared and verified the whisper. Wires were already active. The 29th Punjab Infantry had been ordered from Mandalay. Guests pressed round, eagerly snatching at scraps of information. Germans and British glanced curiously at one another, and presently the gathering dissolved, to talk, to write, and to cable. For several days nothing remarkable occurred, save that the outgoing mail carried a number of British, who had booked their passages at the last moment. Officers on leave were recalled. A few big business houses were closed, and in the district, many German mills and a large influx of stalwart young employees who had been working in them and could not speak a word of English suddenly flocked in, prepared to embark for Europe, to fight for the fatherland. Every berth in the Blankshire had been secured, and the night before she sailed, the well-known German club gave its parting dinner, a wild affair with unlimited quantities of champagne, loud patriotic speeches, songs and shouts of Deutschland über alles, and finally a smashing of glass, a breaking of furniture, and the customary wrecking of the premises. In her frequent journeys from Rangoon, the popular Blankshire had never been so crowded as on the present occasion. Every berth was taken, chiefly by German passengers, who had also bespoken the chief seats at table and the best positions for their deck chairs. Such was the crush that there would be no room whatever for casual travelers from Colombo or Port Said. The British, who were in a comparatively small minority, realized that a very bad time lay before them, when they and their country's enemies must pass weeks and weeks in close proximity. Many had caught the previous steamer, but the remnant included Mrs. Gregory, Sophy, Shafto, and McNabb, who was actually paying the passage out of his hoarded funds, and sternly resolved to join the Cameronians. The party were figuratively swamped by the multitude of Teutons, who had swarmed on board, already looking truculent, arrogant, and victorious, drinking and toasting one another noisily in vast libations at the bar. On the wharf an immense gathering of natives assembled to speed numbers of kind and generous patrons who, with an eye to the future, had distributed a considerable amount of largesse and flattery, as well as silk and satin finery. What with the Germans and their native friends, egress from and ingress to the steamer were almost impossible. The gangway was choked, and the shouting and hurrahing actually drowned the noise of the donkey engine. Many friends had come to see the last of Mrs. Gregory and her party. The military and official element were bound to remain in Rangoon. Sophy was talking to Miss Maitland and Ella Pomeroy, when a fresh influx of joyous and exultant Germans came pouring down the gangway with the force and violence of a human cataract. Sophy and her friends were thrust rudely apart, and from where she had been pushed against the bulwarks, she saw Frau Worm pass by, also Frau Müller, who threw her a glance that seemed to distill hatred. She was immediately followed by Bernard, looking extraordinarily elated and deeply flushed. Catching sight of Sophy, he halted, clicked his heels together, and said, with a sort of savage courtesy, "Ah, so here we are again, you and I, Miss Lay, on the old ship that brought us out. I am delighted to have your company." Sophy looked round for some means of escape, but she was helpless, being tightly wedged in between two bulwarks, the bulwark of the Blankshire and Bernard's solid form, and separated from Mrs. Gregory by a seething crowd of jubilant Teutons. "So der Tag has come at last," he continued, staring into her face with arrogant blue eyes, "and we are on the eve of great events. I am about to join my Brandenburger regiment. Every German is a soldier. We have several hundred reservists on board." Sophy at last found her voice and murmured, "No doubt." "I caught sight of Shafto just now. Why is he going home?" "To serve his country." "Ah, bah! Better stick to his pen. It takes 2 years to make a soldier. In 10 days we shall be in Paris, in a month in London, and why not? You have no army. We are a nation of fighting men, and you are a nation of shopkeepers." "Of course we are not prepared. We would not listen to Lord Roberts, and, on the other hand, you have been arming and drilling and shipbuilding for the last 40 years. Ah, well, mein liebe Fräulein, we must spread our borders. Who would expect the greatest nation in the world to remain cooped up in the North Sea? We demand and we will have space, power, and the sun. We understand patriotism and the love of country." "The love of other people's countries," interposed Sophy sharply. "You Germans are everywhere, like the sparrows. To other nations we bring valuable lessons in industry and culture, prudence, thrift, and energy. Other countries are only too fortunate to receive us. We have brains, bold hearts, and discipline, and know how to use them. Old Blücher, who won Waterloo, may yet find his aspirations fulfilled." "Ah, you mean the sack and plunder of London?" He nodded an impressive assent, and then said, "When I am there, I shall call on you and show you my loot." As he spoke, he leant towards her, his eyes exultant, his breath heavy with champagne. Sophy instinctively recoiled and said, "Pray do not trouble." Bernard gave a loud and boisterous laugh. "It will be Missy can't see. By the way, talking of loot, do you know that Herr Kraus is dead?" "Dead?" she repeated. "No, I heard he had gone to Java." "He has gone to his grave. Last night I was told his body was found floating near the landing stage at Moulmein. There were no marks on it, no signs of a violent end, and yet he was the last man in the world to commit suicide." "Yes," assented Sophy. "He had so many plans and schemes for the future." "They say a little bunch of coarse black hair was found in his clutch. However, at the inquest they've brought in a verdict of found drowned. It saved trouble. I wonder who will get his money. He was enormously rich." "With ill-gotten gains." "Well, he must have some German kin to claim his fortune, and I'll make it my business to find out all I can when I return here." "So you are coming back?" "Why, of course. Possibly in 6 months. I leave my house and belongings all standing. Business is but temporarily closed. Burma, as old Kraus used to say, is the land of opportunity. When next I see the Golden Pagoda, the whole of this rich and fertile company will belong to us." "You are sanguine." "Sanguine, I am certain. And why not? Look at our wonderful trade. And the Burmese themselves like us 1,000,000 times better than you English." "Simply because you bribe them with money and presents." "But look at the crowds," waving his hands toward the masses, "who have come to say Auf Wiedersehen. Thousands and thousands." Then he turned his bold, arrogant eyes on Sophy and said, Your country has no chance against us, Miss Lee. We shall crush you like pulp. Your money, treasures, and trade will all be ours." "Hello!" he exclaimed. "What are these police doing? Mounted police, too! Any escaped convicts on board?" As he stood and watched, the swaying masses were parted with authority, and a large force ranged up on the quay. Officers and officials came on board, armed with an order from the lieutenant governor. Among the first strode Fitzgerald, in full uniform, not the everyday genial Patrick, but a smart, stern guardian of the law. Approaching the bragging Bernard, he said with frigid severity, "Be good enough to go ashore, Herr Bernhard." "What?" stammered his prisoner, who had become livid. "What the devil are you talking about? How dare you interfere with me, or give me an order?" "Official order," rejoined Fitzgerald, entirely unmoved. "All men of German nationality to disembark immediately and be interned." Sophy now made a forcible and frantic effort to effect her escape from this hateful situation, and struggling through the crowd, eventually managed to join her own friends. Disembark! To be interned! What a thunderbolt! All at once Bernard's flushed countenance became livid, his eyes glared savagely, and there suddenly spread a choking, suffocating expression on his large, handsome face. The noise and clamor of hoarse, angry voices became almost stupefying, but in the end the Teutons were compelled to accept the inevitable, and gradually streamed ashore, carrying their hand baggage, parcels of delicatessen, and other comforts intended for the voyage. The heavy baggage was hastily landed, for the Blankshire had steamed up and was bound to catch the tide. A more than half-empty ship, she now slipped from her berth and turned her bows toward home. As she glided slowly by the wharf, Shafto and Sophy waved vigorous farewells to their numerous friends, Burmese and European. There was Roscoe, there were the Salters and Rosetta. Apart from all, a solitary little figure stood prominent on a heap of rice bags. It was Chit, waving a pink silk handkerchief. For once she was not smiling. Her piquant face was grave, and the eyes fixed upon Shafto conveyed an eloquent and heartbroken farewell. Presently she cowered down and hid her face. "That was a wonderfully smart coup," said a ship's officer to Mrs. Gregory and Sophy. "Those German fellows that were trampling all over the ship as if she was their own property were neatly caught. They will be shipped off to India out of harm's way, and within a week or two, I fancy, they will find themselves at Ahmednagar." The interned passengers had left ample space and a grateful sense of relief and freedom. As the Blankshire throbbed down past the Hastings, Shafto and Sophy stood side by side, taking their last look at the great pagoda, which gave an impression of being swathed in a mantle of dazzling gold, and dominated all its surroundings. "It seems only the other day we were coming up the river in this very old boat," he said, "a year and 10 months ago, and how much has happened in that time. Well, we have had strange experiences, seen many places, and made many friends. Here's one of them now," indicating Mrs. Gregory. "I expect she feels a bit down after parting with old George, although he does follow in 3 months. So do you try to cheer her while I go below and hurry up the tea." End of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Marianne Hadley. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Chapter 37. The Tug of War. One evening after they had been several days at sea, Sophy and Shafto were gazing down at the steerage passengers. She said, "I've noticed such an odd person watching you. He looks as if he knew you." "Knew me?" repeated Shafto. "What is he like?" a tall, broad-shouldered, lanky man. There he is, leaning over the side, wearing a blue serge suit and a soft felt hat. Shafto stared for a moment. Then he said, "By George, I do know him, though I can hardly believe my eyes. I'll go and speak to him and find out what this means." And he hurried away below. "Hello, Mung Baw!" he exclaimed. "Say, this is something like a surprise. What are you doing here?" "Much the same as yourself, sir. The Tug of War is drawing us all home. I have left Mung Baw and the yellow robe behind me, and now I'm Corporal Michael Ryan. I'm going into the army again. Why, I'm only 34 when all's said and done. Of course the shaven head ages a fellow, but I'll grow me hair on me passage home, and maybe a mustache as well. Someone told me that kerosene oil is a grand thing. And you are going to join up too, sir?" "I hope so. I put 2 terms at Sandhurst, so I shall have a try. I should like to get into the flying corps." "And what will herself say," with a glance towards Sophy on the main deck, "to all this fighting and flying?" "Oh, Miss Lee won't stand in my way. She intends to look for a job too. Tell me, Michael, do you really believe they will take you back into the service after your adventure in Upper Burma and 7 years' absence without leave?" "Well, since ye ask me, sir, in my opinion, they might do worse. Anyhow, I'll have a good try. I might get a sort of doctor's certificate. Mental, you know. I'm a first-class shot, though naturally a bit out of practice, and very hefty with the bayonet. I'd like well to stir them Germans up, ever since one great ugly brute went out of his way to give me a kick. I was black and blue for weeks. Did you hear them the day before they were took off? Just screeching mad, shouting and drinking as if the world was their own. Well, anyhow, I can enlist as full private. I'm sound in wind and limb. And I tell ye, we want all the men we can get. For I heard them Germans talking very big in Rangoon, saying they'd eat us all up within the next 3 months, body, sleeves, and trimmings." "Easier said than done," rejoined Shafto, "although they have a splendid army and thousands of big guns. I'd like well to have a hand in real fighting. None of your autumn maneuvers, but the proper thing. And after I put the war over, I'll go and see Ireland. It's strange, though. I'm Irish. I've never put a toe in the country, and never been nearer it than a black native. My father's people were reared in the Galtees. It's my Irish blood that's uppermost now, and driving me home. I've often heard the boys talking of the grand purple mountains, the wonderful greenery everywhere, and the lovely soft moist air. Well, Michael, I hope you may see it all some day. What put it into your head to throw off the yellow robe and take this sudden start?" "It was the barrack talk, sir. I heard them chaps cursin' and groanin' that they were stuck fast in Rangoon and had no chance of gettin' a look in. And says I to myself, what's to hinder you from goin'?" "But how about the passage money?" inquired Shafto. "I thought you were vowed to poverty and had nothing in your wooden bowl." "I had the ruby that you gave back to me. I believe it was a rare fine stone. I had it in me mind to offer it to the pagoda. It was well I waited, as things turned out. A friend sold it for me in the bazaar. He got 400 pounds of English money. He says it was worth some thousands. It was bought for a pagoda, anyhow, and I have a nice big sum lodged in a London bank, and when the war is over, please God, it will help to settle me in a small place in Ireland. I took me passage and bought some kit, and I have a few pounds in hand, so that I won't be stranded. At first I felt the clothes terrible awkward, especially the trousers, after living in a petticoat so long. And I did not know what to be doing with a knife and fork, and leading such a quiet, cramped sort of life, I lost the use of myself. But I tramped up and down the decks for a couple of hours of a morning, and a nice young fellow in the pantry has lent me a pair of dumbbells. By the time I get to England, I'll be well set up with the black mustache, and mabbe, you'll hardly know me." "How did you get rid of the yellow robe?" "Oh, easy enough, and without any ceremony of disgrace whatever. Sure, half the Burmans you meet have worn it for perhaps a year or two, but it's not everyone who has the vocation. I can't understand your ever taking to it. Can ye not, sir? Rejoined the ex-pongee, laying muscular hand on the bulwark and fixing a faraway abstracted gaze upon the lazy green sea. I may as well tell ye that the first story I made out to ye was not altogether the truth. I had in me mind a mental reservation. I just slipped out of army life and hid myself in the forests, all along of a little girlie. His lower lip trembled as he added, "She died, sir, and I was just broke over it." "Oh," exclaimed Shafto, "well, such things have happened before." "It was like this, sir," now turning and fixing a pair of tragic dark eyes on his companion. "I was engaged to be married, same as yourself. She was the daughter of a sergeant in the arsenal in Madras. Her father and mine were old friends, and when mine was killed in Afghanistan, me mother just dwindled away and broke her heart. Sergeant Farron and his wife was real good to me and took me home. She mothered me and she belted me, and they helped to start me for the Lawrence Asylum Orphanage. I was about 8 years of age then, and this little girl was 2. After a good spell I came back to St. George Fort, a grown-up man and a corporal. Polly, she was grown up too, and the prettiest girl you could see in 1,000 miles. We fell in love with one another, and Sergeant Farron had sort of wished for me, being, they say, the very spirit of me own father, and though I knew in me heart Polly was a million times too good for me, and I was not fit to wipe her shoes, still I made bold to ask him for her, and he said yes. I knew I'd get permission to marry, for my name was never in the defaulter's book, and Polly was fair as a lily, not one of your yellow cranies, the colonel was so dead set again. Well, I was just too happy to be lucky, saving up me pay and Mrs. Farron buying a few bits of house linen for us, and Polly making her trousseau, when the regiment was shifted all of a sudden from Madras to Mandalay, and our plans were knocked on the head. "Yes, that was bad luck," said Shafto sympathetically. Still in all, I was full of hope, expecting my stripes and hearing every mail from Polly, when one day the letter corporal handed me an envelope with a deep black edge. It was from Sergeant Farron, telling me Polly was dead, taken off in 3 hours with cholera. He enclosed half a letter she was writing to me when she was called. Well, sir, I would not believe it. No, I held out again it for days, but of course I had to give in. At first the grief was just a little scratch, but every day the pain went deeper and deeper, as if someone was turning a knife in my heart. To think I'd never look upon her again or hear her voice, and her gay laugh, it seemed impossible. But in the end I believed, and I felt as if I was groping about in black darkness. What had I to live for? What was the good of going on? At times I thought of my rifle, but I put that idea aside because of the regiment and the scandal in the newspapers. Still, I was always meditating some way out. I think now, if I'd opened my mind to one of my pals, it would have been easier, and I'd not have felt it so cruel hard, but somehow I'd never breathed the name of Polly to one of them. I held her like a holy thing apart. I could not stand the talk and the coarse chaff of the barrack room, so I kept my trouble sealed up, till at last it grew too big for me, and I made up my mind to do away with meself, where no one would be a penny the wiser. I got a couple of days' leave, by way of seeing a pal at Tonghu, and I went up the river and away into the jungles, and wandering about looking for some venomous reptile to put an end to me in a natural way. But if you'll believe me, sir, divil a bite I could get. Not after searching for half a day, and of course, had I been looking without intention, I'd have found dozens. What with walking miles in the blazing sun and nothing to eat, I believe I fell down with a stroke, and some woodcutters found me and carried me into their village, a big place with a great thorn hedge and gates to keep off the dacoits. The head man they call a thuggee took me over, and his women nursed me. He was a rich fellow with 4 yoke of oxen, and so no expense was spared. And there I lived for many a long day, very strange and out of myself. I could not remember who I was, nor where I came from. All the clothes I had to me name was a shirt and a pair of drawers. By degrees, thanks to great charity and kindness, I come round. I remember everything only too well. And then I buried McRyan in the jungle, and became a Pongee. The peace and quiet ate into me very bones, and I took on the yellow robe. The rest and the holy life tamed me, and did a soul good. And many an evening, when I'd be roaming in the forest among the splendid tall trees and beautiful flowers, with the birds and the animals around me so tame and at their ease, I'd have a feelin' that Polly was walkin' alongside of me, the face on her shinin' with the light of heaven. But, drawing himself erect, excuse me, sir, for bothering you with all this foolish, crazy sort of talk. Not at all, said Shafto. Thank you so much for telling me your story. I am truly sorry for you, Ryan. It was hard lines losing your Polly. Do you mind telling me some more? After you had recovered your memory and become a Pongee, what happened next? Well, after a while, I chanced to see English papers and hear outside news, and I got a cast in a cargo boat down the river. I had a sort of longin' to see the soldiers. The love of the service is in me blood. So now and then I was drawn to Rangoon to get a sight of the khaki and to hear the barrack yarns. You see, 1/4 of me is Singalese. I suppose me grandfather on one side was a Buddhist, and that is how Pongee life came so pleasant and easy to me. The 3/4 of me is an Irish soldier, and every day the soldier within me grows, and the Pongee dies away. And you will never return to Burma? Never, no. I have laid out to go to Ireland and spend the rest of my time there when the war is over. Ah, I wonder when the war will be over, said Shafto. God alone knows, exclaimed the Pongee. They were talking in the bazaar about the end coming about Christmas. I think myself it will be a long business, and an awkward business, too. So do I, agreed Shafto, recalling the sage remarks of George Gregory. Yes, it's like a light stuck in an old thatch. We'll have half the world in it before long, and the greatest blaze as ever was known. I see that Australia and Canada and South Africa are all coming to lend a hand. Well, we want every hand we can get, and every foot too. I've heard plenty of big talk in the bazaar, where the Germans have laid out a mint of money. By all accounts they are going to take Persia, India, Burma, the whole of our trade, money and fleet. Well, if that comes off, it'll be a cold world. By the way, sir, he continued in another tone, did you see Ma Chit the day we were leaving Rangoon, signin' and wavin' to ye as we cast off? Shafto nodded curtly. And ye never took no notice? Ye might have given her just a small sign to ease her heart, but I'm thinking ye have a hard drop in ye. I dare say I have, assented Shafto, and I'm glad of it, for now and then it has prevented me from making an awful fool of myself. Ah, well, sometimes the fools have the best of it. Not that I'm saying a word in favor of Ma Chit, only that if you'd waved your hand, she'd have gone away with a small bit of consolation and comfort. By the way, Ryan, what did you mean by saying you were a magician? Oh, that was only a bit of a boast, sir. I know a few tricks I learnt in the regiment. One of the privates was professional conjurer, and mighty clever when sober. When I showed off 1 or 2 little tricks with stones or buttons or bits of string, the Burmans were sure I was a real wizard, and looked up to me. So they did, and then the birds and animals being so friendly, I was always so much at ease with them, and the children, they said I cast spells. The steerage passengers were not a little surprised to note the foregathering of a first-class passenger with this odd, reserved person, whose shaven head was associated in their opinion with the interior of Rangoon jail. Nor was this all. Now and then a remarkably pretty young lady accompanied the said first-class passenger and brought fruit and books and cakes, and the three appeared to be on the best of terms. The Pongee and Shafto had many long talks together. They discussed life among the Burmese, the prospects of war, the changes that might awake and shake the world, and, appropriate supplement to the topic of war, more than once they spoke of death. "I've been so long with the Buddhists that the fear of the grave is wore out of me," said Ryan. "I'd almost as soon be dead as not. It's only another new life. You just step in and meet your old friends. I suppose, sir, you do not go along with me there." "No," replied Shafto, who had an all-Englishman's shrinking reluctance to discuss his belief or his inner life. "Yours is a nice easy path, too good to be true, I'm afraid. My creed is to do our best, to help other people, and to take what comes." "Goodness knows you have helped me, Mr. Shafto," and the Pongee drew back a step and looked at him queerly. "What with savin' me life and then making sort of friends with me, as man to man, your kindness will stand in me memory till the clay is over me." Shafto and the Pongee separated at Marseille. The latter went round by the bay, whilst Mrs. Gregory and her party travelled overland, and they did not meet again for nearly 2 years. End of chapter 37. Read by Marianne Hadley.
Section 38 of The Road to Mandalay. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC. The Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker. Sergeant Major Ryan. Many months later, on a clear February night, Shafto and Tremahir stood together outside headquarters. Somewhere in France, anxiously observing the signs in the sky. Shafto, a machine gun officer attached to the Blanks, had been granted 24 hours leave and made a muddy and dangerous journey of 15 miles to visit his old school fellow, now on the staff of a general commanding division. He was challenged, and so was his companion. Their faces expressed the long strain of a terrible war. Both looked years older than their actual age, for, like the sons and daughters of the worshippers of Moloch, they had passed through the fire. Shafto was fine drawn to leanness. Heavy lines were scored on his forehead. He had twice been wounded, had taken part in desperate fighting, witnessed many harrowing sights, and lost many friends. The chill air was full of sounds, a continuous rolling of wheels, rumbling of guns, and the distant scream of a shell. "There goes a signal to lengthen the German range," remarked Shafto. "That's right, for they often show up lights that mean nothing. Look at that aeroplane of ours dropping red stars over the Boche's first line of trenches. I suppose the lines are fairly close." "By Jove, you may say so. The men can shout across at one another, but the trenches are a good 4 miles from where we stand." As he concluded, a star shell broke and lit up a vast expanse of gleaming mud. To the rolling and rumbling was now added a faraway sound of tramping feet and song. "Here they come," exclaimed Tremahir. "Back to billets. They changed at 6 o'clock. But it's heavy going, mostly wading in slosh." The marching came nearer and nearer, also the sound of singing and mouth organs. "Michigan," said Shafto, "is a favorite. Poor old Tipperary is down and out." Presently the force, which had been relieved, muddied to the waist, but splendidly cheerful, splashed into the great courtyard. "Irish," explained Tremahir, Magnificent fellows, born fighters. They watched the men as they fell out and scattered to their quarters in outhouses, barns, and offices, and then Shaftu and his friends made their way into the battered old chateau and temporary orderly room, once a lady's boudoir. It still exhibited stripes of artistic wallpaper, a cracked mirror, a beautiful Louis XIV cabinet stacked with papers, a few rude chairs, a couple of wooden tables. Presently, a sergeant major came in to report, a fine stalwart fellow with a heavy black mustache and, in spite of his muddy waders, an air of complete self-possession. Having saluted and handed over his papers, his quick blue eyes rested on Shaftu. He started, saluted, and said, "I beg your pardon, Mr. Shaftu, sir, but I see you don't know me." "Well, no, I can't say that I do," replied Shaftu, casting his mind over the last 18 months. "Well, of course, sir, I'm entirely different to what ye may remember in Rangoon." "What? You don't mean to say—" The late Ponji nodded with emphasis. "I'm now Sergeant Major Ryan, in the 2nd Battalion of the old regiment." Then suddenly stepping back and lowering his voice, he added, "They think I'm me brother, sure. I never had one. And how is yourself, sir?" "All right. I'm a machine gun officer attached to the blanks." "And the young lady?" "She's a Red Cross nurse at Reun. I saw her 3 months ago." "When next you meet, will you give her my humble respects and tell her I've not forgotten her invitation, and I'm coming to the wedding?" "And no one will be more welcome. You have our address. I'm told you've been in some heavy fighting." "Well, yes, sir. At Pries, we lost 18 of our officers. Oh, it was a cruel bad mix-up. Still and all, the Boches were given their tea in a mug. After our last charge, you'd see them going every way, like crows in a storm. Our guns are grand. As for them aeroplanes, they do all but speak. And the tanks are wonders. God bless them." "You have been wounded?" "Only just a cat's scratch. The German wire is mighty stiff, and there's 6-inch spikes. Well, since we were last together, sir, you and I have been through a strange time and seen sights as we can't talk about. One thing is sure, we'll worry through all right." "Oh, yes, we shall. And give the Boches something to think about." Then suddenly opening of a distant door released a roar of voices singing, "Take me back to Blighty," a rousing demand which instantly recalled the sergeant major to his duty. "Well, sir," he said, "I must be moving, so I'll wish you goodbye and best of luck." "The same to you, Ryan. You'll let us have a line to say how you get on, won't you?" Shafto held out his hand. Ryan gave it a hard, convulsive squeeze, and in another moment the stalwart Irishman had saluted and tramped forth. "An old friend, I see," remarked Tremahir. "Yes, I knew him in Burma. He's a tip-top non-com, and has the DCM and the French Cross. He worked miracles when his officers were killed at Pries. They offered him a commission, but he wouldn't take it. The men love him, though he has some funny fads, never touches meat, and sings queer outlandish chants. But he's the splendid sort of fellow who was born for this war, full of heroic qualities and as hard as a bag of nails. I suppose his regiment was in Rangoon. Not in my time, replied Shaftu. He hesitated for a moment and then added, if I were to tell you how I came across that Irish sergeant major, you'd say I was pulling your leg. Oh, go on then, pull away. When I first met him, he was a Burmese priest with a shorn head, yellow robe, and begging bowl. Come, I say, Douglas, this is a bit too much. But it's a fact. He had been a soldier for 6 or 7 years, got a bad stroke in the jungle, was taken in by Burmans, and was for 7 years a Ponji. When the war broke out, he flung off his yellow robe, paid his passage to England, and is here, as you see, in his element. It's amazing, incredible, but incredible things come off nowadays. Shaftu nodded. If he gets through this, do you suppose he will return to his monastery? Never. It is his fixed intention to go to Ireland. He has some money and hopes to settle down on his own little farm. I'm afraid he's some way off that yet. In the meanwhile, he is seeing a good bit of life and death, mentally added Shaftu. I say, exclaimed Tremhere, glancing at his wristwatch, it's time for our dinner. Come on. In the autumn of the same year, Shaftu, who had again been severely wounded, was granted a month's leave, and he and Sophy were married. It was the usual war wedding, no bridesmaids and no reception. Among the friends welcome at the church were the Gregorys, Tebbs, Larchers, McNabbs, Mrs. Malone, Mr. Hutton, and the Tremheres. Captain Tremhere supported his friend as best man. One specially bidden guest was absent from the gathering. He lay beneath a black wooden cross nearby to Guinchy, where gallant Irish regiments had immortalized their colors. Alas, Sergeant Major Michael Ryan was among the missing. To the unspeakable grief of his comrades, he had gone west, but not to Ireland. End of section 38. End of the Road to Mandalay by Bithia Mary Croker.